Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I first noticed it because the line was too clean. I'd been out there about a week, running seismic surveys along a stretch of land just outside the restricted boundary. Nothing unusual about the job. We were mapping minor ground movement, checking for fault shifts, the kind of baseline data they like to keep updated in case anything changes. Most of the readings were what you'd expect. Background noise, occasional low-level tremors, nothing that stood out. The equipment I was using wasn't top tier, but it was sensitive enough to pick up subtle movement. Usually that just meant wind, distant track, or the earth settling in ways you don't think about. That morning was cold and clear. Early light, barely any wind. I'd set up one of the sensors about half a mile from my truck, anchored it, and started recording. The first tremor showed up around 6:20 a.m. It was small, barely above background noise, but it was sharp, like a clean spike instead of the usual messy ripple you get from natural movement. I didn't think much of it. Logged it, checked the calibration, moved on. Then it happened again. Same shape, same intensity, almost identical. I checked the timestamp. Exactly 3 minutes later. That got my attention. Natural tremors don't space themselves like that. Not evenly. Not that precise. I stayed with the sensor, watching the data scroll in real time. 3 minutes later, it happened again. Same spike, same clean edge, same duration. I crouched there, staring at the screen, waiting for the next one. When it came, it matched the others perfectly. Okay, I said out loud, even though there was no one around. I checked the equipment, made sure the sensor was stable, the ground anchor secure, no loose connections, no interference from my truck or any nearby electronics. Everything looked normal. I pulled up the secondary sensor a few hundred yards away. It showed the same pattern, same timing, same spikes. Whatever was causing it wasn't localized to one point. It was moving through the ground or coming from below. I stayed there for the next half hour, logging each event as it came in. Every 3 minutes, no variation, no drift, just that same steady repeating tremor. By mid-morning, I had a clean sequence recorded, enough to show a pattern, not just a coincidence. I packed up and headed back to the temporary station we'd set up near the road. My supervisor, Danvers, was already there, going through his own data. Got something weird, I said, handing him the tablet. He skimmed through it, nodding slowly. Looks like interference, he said. From what? I asked. He shrugged. Could be anything. Equipment glitch. Environmental noise. It's repeating, I said. Every 3 minutes, exactly. He looked at me, then back at the screen. Still interference, he said. That didn't sit right. Shouldn't we check it out? I asked. If it's consistent like this, we'll flag it, he said, cutting me off. Mark it for review. That was it. No follow-up, no interest in the pattern, just a note in the system. I went back out that afternoon, set up another sensor farther down the line, closer to the boundary. The tremors were still there, same interval, same shape. But something else had changed. They were slightly stronger, not by much, just enough that the spikes were a little more pronounced. I checked the timing again, still every 3 minutes. But now, if I zoomed in on the waveform, I could see something I hadn't noticed before. Each spike wasn't a single event. It was two. A primary pulse, followed by a smaller one about half a second later. Like an echo, or a response. I sat there in the heat, staring at the screen, trying to make sense of it. Natural earthquakes don't do that. Not in a clean, repeatable way. And they definitely don't keep perfect time. I recorded another hour of data, then headed back. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The regularity, the precision. It didn't feel random. It felt deliberate. The next morning, I checked the system. My data had been updated, or rather changed. The tremors were still there, but the annotations were different. Each one was labeled as equipment interference. No mention of timing. No mention of pattern. Just a generic tag applied across the board. I went to Danvers. Why'd you mark it like this? I asked. He didn't look up from his desk. That's what it is, he said. It's not, I said. You saw the data. It's consistent. He finally looked at me. Doesn't matter, he said. That's the classification. I stood there for a second, waiting for him to explain. He didn't. "Shouldn't we at least investigate?" I asked. "No." That was the end of the conversation. I went back out anyway. This desk set up 3 sensors this time, spaced farther apart, trying to triangulate the source. The tremors came right on schedule. But now, with multiple sensors, I could see something else. The signal wasn't coming from a single point. It was moving. Each sensor picked up the tremor at a slightly different time, but the interval stayed consistent, like something was passing beneath them, slowly, steadily, in a straight line. I mapped the delay between sensors, did a rough calculation. Whatever it was moving at a constant speed, not fast, not slow, just consistent. I stood there in the late afternoon heat, looking out over the desert, trying to imagine something moving under the ground like that. There were no vehicles, no drilling operations, nothing that would explain it. And even if there had been, it wouldn't have been that precise. As the sun started to set, the tremors continued. Every 3 minutes. Same pattern, same echo. I packed up as the light faded, but I left one sensor running overnight, just to see what would happen. The next morning, I checked the data. The tremors had continued through the night. No gaps, no variation until 2:18 a.m. After that, nothing. The pattern just stopped. No gradual fade, no change in intensity, just a clean break, like whatever was causing it had turned off. I brought the data back to the station. By the time I got there, my access had been restricted. Couldn't open the files I just recorded, couldn't pull up the logs. Danvers was already waiting. "Your assignment's been shortened," he said. "You're heading back today." "Why?" I asked. "Project complete." "That doesn't make sense," I said. "We're not done mapping." "We are," he said. I looked at him, trying to read something in his expression. There was nothing there, just a flat, neutral look. "What about the tremors?" I asked. "Equipment interference," he said. Same answer, same tone. I didn't argue. Packed up my gear, loaded the truck, drove out. As I hit the highway, I checked the tablet one last time. The data from that last night was gone. No record of the tremors stopping, no record of them happening at all. Just a clean data set with no anomalies, like the ground had been perfectly still the entire time. But I knew what I'd seen, every 3 minutes, like a heartbeat or a signal, something repeating over and over just beneath the surface. And then, all at once, it stopped. I noticed the clock first because it didn't match the radio. I'd been driving for a couple hours already, heading north along that long, empty stretch people call the extraterrestrial highway. It was late afternoon, sun dropping, but still bright enough to wash everything out into that pale desert glare. No traffic, no buildings, just road and open land in every direction. I was running a little behind schedule, so I kept checking the time. Dashboard said 5:12. The radio station, one of the few that came in out there, did a quick time check at 5:04. I remember frowning at that. "Radio's off," I said out loud, even though I knew that didn't make much sense. Stations are usually synced better than that. I picked up my phone, checked it. 5:04. Now that didn't sit right. I looked back at the dash. 5:12. 8 minutes ahead. I tapped the clock display like that would do anything. It didn't. "All right," I muttered. "Whatever." I figured maybe the truck's internal clock had drifted. It wasn't a new vehicle, company issued, nothing special. I kept driving. The road was straight, stretching out in front of me like it always does out there. I passed one of the mile markers, 167, I think. I wasn't paying that close attention at the time, just enough to register it in passing. A few minutes later, I checked the dash again, still 5 or 12. Then, right as I was looking at it, the numbers changed. 5:20. No transition. No ticking forward. Just 5:20. I blinked, thinking maybe I'd misread it. I grabbed my phone again. 5:12. I felt that slight drop in my stomach, the kind you get when something doesn't line up and your brain hasn't caught up yet. I held the phone up next to the dash. 2 different times, 8 minutes apart. "Okay," I said, slower this time. I glanced at the road. Still empty. Same stretch of asphalt, same low hills in the distance. No turns, no intersections, nothing that would explain any kind of time jump. I checked the radio again. No signal now. Just static. That wasn't unusual out there. Stations come and go. I focused back on the road, telling myself it was just a glitch. Electrical issue. Nothing more. But I kept checking. Every few seconds, the dash stayed at 520. My phone stayed at 512. I drove like that for what felt like a couple minutes. Then something else happened. The dash clock flickered. Not the numbers, just the backlight, like it dimmed for a split second. Then the time changed again. 512. Back to what my phone said, like nothing had happened. I sat there, hands tight on the wheel, staring at it. I picked up my phone again. 512. Same time. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Okay, I said. That's fine. I didn't believe that. I looked up at the road again. That's when I noticed the mile marker. I slowed down without meaning to. I had passed 167 not long before. I hadn't seen 168. I would have remembered that. I always keep track of markers out there. It's a habit, helps break up the drive. I checked the rearview mirror. Nothing behind me, no other cars, no dust trails, just empty road. I pulled over, didn't even think about it. Just eased onto the shoulder and stopped. The engine idled quietly. I sat there for a second, trying to piece it together. 167, then 169. No memory of the stretch in between. No sense of time passing. I checked the trip meter. Distance matched what it should be if I'd driven it. Fuel level was consistent too. Everything normal, except I couldn't remember it. I stepped out of the truck. The air was still. Warm, but not oppressive. The kind of late-day heat that hangs without moving. I walked a few steps down the road, looking back toward where I'd come from. Nothing unusual, no landmarks I didn't recognize, no reason to think I'd missed anything. I turned and looked ahead. Same thing. Just road. I got back in the truck and sat there for a minute, staring at the dash. 5:13 now. Time moving normally again. I started driving. At first, I kept my speed down, paying closer attention to everything. The road, the markers, the time. I passed 170, then 171. No gaps. No missing stretches. Everything felt normal again. But I couldn't shake that feeling, like I'd skipped something, or something had skipped me. About 10 minutes later, I checked the radio again. It came back on, mid-sentence. Time check, 5:22 p.m. I looked at the dash, 5:22. I looked at my phone, 5:22. Everything lined up. I kept driving, but I didn't relax. Every mile marker after that, I made a point to say the number out loud as I passed it, 172, 173. Just to anchor myself. Nothing else happened. I made it to my destination without any more issues. That night, I tried to think back on that missing stretch, what I'd seen, what I'd felt. Nothing came up. It was just blank. Not like I'd forgotten details, like there were no details to remember. A few days later, I drove that same route again. Same time of day, same direction. When I hit mile marker 167, I slowed down, watched the road carefully. 168 came into view exactly where it should have been. I passed it. Nothing happened. The clock stayed steady. No jumps, no flickers, just normal driving. I kept going past 169, then pulled over again. Got out, stood there, looked back at the stretch between them. It looked exactly like every other part of that road. Empty. Uneventful. But standing there, I had the same feeling I'd had before. Like something had happened in that space, something I wasn't meant to keep. I got back in the truck and drove off. Now, every time I check the clock while I'm out there, I do it twice. Once on the dash, once on my phone, just to make sure they agree. And every time I pass those mile markers, I pay attention, because I still can't account for those 8 minutes, or what was on that stretch of road while I wasn't. I didn't think much of it when Martin mentioned it at first. He caught me outside around mid-morning while I was dragging the bins back up the driveway. My name's Elliot. I live in a pretty normal suburban street. Semi-detached houses, small front gardens, nothing isolated. Martin lives 2 doors down. Retired, always out early, notices everything. He said, "You have something going on last night?" I asked what he meant, and he just pointed up over my roof. "Lights," he said, "just sitting there." I laughed a little, thinking he meant a drone or something. He shook his head. "No sound. Didn't move like that." I asked what time. "Late," he said. "After midnight. I was up anyway." I shrugged it off. I told him I'd been asleep, hadn't heard anything. He kept looking at the house while we talked, like he expected to see something still there. "Stayed for a bit," he added, "then just gone." That stuck with me a bit more than I expected. Not enough to take it seriously, but enough that I checked my phone when I got back inside. No notifications, no alerts. I have a camera set up over the front door, nothing fancy, just one of those basic systems that records when it detects motion. I opened the app and scrolled back to the night before. There was a recording around 0:47. I tapped it. The footage started normally. Empty street, front garden in frame, the usual grainy night view. Then, for a split second, the image flickered, like a quick exposure change. The brightness jumped slightly, then it went back to normal. At first, I thought that was it, just a glitch. But the timestamp in the corner caught my eye. It jumped. Not smoothly. It went from 4012 to 4718. 6 seconds missing. No transition, no cut, just skipped. I rewound it and watched again. Same thing, normal footage, brief flicker, then the time jumped forward. I scrubbed through the rest of the recording, nothing else unusual, no movement, no lights, just that flicker and the gap. I checked the next clip, there was one at 103, same pattern, stillness. Then a quick flicker, then a jump in time. 5 seconds missing this time. I felt that slight tension start in my chest, not fear exactly, just something not lining up. I checked earlier clips, everything before midnight looked normal, no flickers, no missing frames. Just quiet footage of the street. I went back to the 47 clip again and paused it right before the flicker. Zoomed in as much as I could, nothing obvious, no lights, no movement, just the usual view. I let it play. The flicker happened so quickly it was hard to catch. But if I slowed it down, frame by frame, there was one frame where everything looked slightly off. Not distorted, just shifted, like the angle had changed by a fraction. Then it snapped back, and the time jumped. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. It didn't make sense. If something had triggered the camera, there should have been more footage, not less. I checked the back camera too. Same thing. A clip at 52. Flicker. Missing time. Nothing visible. I started paying more attention to the house itself. Nothing looked out of place. Doors locked, windows closed, everything normal. But I couldn't shake what Martin had said. Lights hovering above. No sound. I went back outside later that afternoon, stood in the driveway and looked up. Clear sky. Nothing unusual. But I tried to imagine where he would have been standing when he saw it. His front garden has a direct line of sight over my roof. I walked over and stood roughly where he would have been. Looked up at the same angle. There's a bit of open sky above the houses there. No trees, no obstructions. If something had been there, you'd see it clearly. That evening I texted him. Asked him to describe what he saw. He replied a few minutes later. 3 lights. Faint. Not bright. Just above your roof. Didn't move. I asked how long. Couple minutes. Maybe more. I looked at the timestamps on the footage again. There were multiple clips with missing frames between 0:47 and just after 01. Short gaps, 5 seconds, 6 seconds, spread out, not continuous. I sat there trying to line it up. If something had been there for a couple of minutes, why only those gaps? Why not a full recording? That night, I left the camera app open on my phone, just watching the live feed while I sat in the living room. Nothing happened. The street stayed quiet. Around midnight, I stepped outside. Cold air. No wind. Everything still. I looked up again. Same empty sky. I stood there for a while, longer than I meant to, listening. There was a faint hum somewhere in the distance, but it didn't seem connected to anything nearby, just background noise. I went back inside eventually and tried to sleep. Sometime in the night, I woke up. No reason I could think of. Just awake. The room felt quiet. Too quiet. I checked my phone. No alerts. I opened the camera app again. There was a new clip. 9. I tapped it. The footage started normally. Empty driveway. Still street. Then the flicker. Quick. Barely noticeable. Then the timestamp jumped. 6 seconds gone. I sat up in bed staring at the screen. I rewound it. Watched it again. Same thing. I paused on the frame just before the flicker. Zoomed in, nothing visible, but something felt different about it. Like the lighting was slightly off. I couldn't place it exactly, just a subtle change. I got out of bed and went to the window, pulled the curtain back slightly, looked out. Nothing. The street was empty. No lights. No movement. I looked up. The sky was clear. Still nothing. I stood there for a minute, just watching. Then I noticed something. The window glass felt warm, not hot, just slightly warmer than the air in the room. I pressed my hand against it. The warmth faded slowly, like it had just been there. I stepped back and looked at the reflection. For a second, I thought I saw something shift in it. Not a shape, just a slight distortion. Then it was gone. I checked the camera feed again. No new clips. Everything normal. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I checked the footage again. There were 2 more clips overnight, both with the same pattern. Flicker, missing frames, nothing visible. I haven't told Martin about that part. He still brings it up sometimes, asking if I figured out what it was. I just tell him the camera glitched. That's easier. But the thing that keeps bothering me isn't the lights he saw. It's the fact that whatever was there only shows up as something missing, like it's not captured, just skipped, as if those moments weren't meant to be recorded at all. It started while I was standing in the kitchen, rinsing a mug. I remember because the water was running, and at first I thought the sound was coming from the pipes. My name's Mark. I live alone in a small semi-detached place, nothing unusual about it. Old enough to creak a bit, but not in a way that ever bothered me. The sound was low, not loud enough to grab your attention right away, just something you notice after a second, like it's always been there. I turned the tap off. The hum stayed. It didn't echo, didn't bounce around the room. It felt contained, like it was above me. I stood still, listening. The pitch was steady, not electrical exactly, but close, smoother. No vibration through the floor or walls, just the sound itself. I looked up at the ceiling without thinking. Plain plaster, no lights on, no visible source. I moved into the hallway. The hum followed. Same volume, same tone. I paused halfway between rooms. It didn't get louder or quieter depending on where I stood. It just felt like it was directly overhead. Always. I checked the lights, flicked a few switches, nothing changed. No flickering, no buzzing from fixtures. The sound didn't react. I walked into the living room. Same thing. The hum stayed centered above me. I tried to locate it properly, moved side to side, but it didn't behave like a normal sound. There was no direction to it. Just above. I stood under the center of the room and listened carefully. The pitch was constant, but there was something under it. A slight variation. Almost like a second tone layered underneath, shifting very slowly. I frowned and looked at the ceiling again. There's a loft above, but nothing up there except insulation and a few boxes. No machinery. No vents. Nothing that would make a sound like that. I walked toward the front door. The hum didn't change. I reached for the handle, hesitated for a second, then opened it. Cold air came in. I stepped outside. The hum stopped instantly. No fade, no trailing echo, just gone. I stood on the doorstep, listening. Nothing. Just the normal outside sounds. Distant traffic, a faint breeze, someone's dog barking a few houses over. I stepped back inside. The hum returned immediately. Same tone, same position above me. I stopped just inside the door, listened, stepped out again. Silence. Back in. Hum. I repeated it a few times. Each time the same thing. Inside, the sound. Outside, nothing. I closed the door and leaned against it for a second, trying to think. Maybe something on the roof. I stepped back outside and looked up. The roofline looked normal. No lights, no movement, no sound. I walked a few steps away from the house, stood in the middle of the street, listened again. Nothing. I turned back and went inside. The hum came back the moment I crossed the threshold. I moved further into the house, slower this time, trying to pinpoint where it was strongest, but it didn't behave like that. It stayed centered, all the way into the bedroom. Same thing. The ceiling there is lower. The sound felt closer, not louder, just nearer. I stood still, looking straight up. The pitch shifted slightly, just for a second, then returned to normal. That small change made it feel less like background noise and more like something active. I stepped back into the hallway. The pitch corrected itself. I went back into the kitchen. Same hum, same steady tone. I grabbed a chair and stood on it, reaching up to touch the ceiling. Nothing. No vibration, no warmth, just solid. I knocked on it lightly. The sound was normal, flat, hollow, no difference, but the hum stayed, unaffected. I climbed down and stood there, hands on the counter. The room felt slightly off. Not colder exactly, just still. More still than it should have been. I realized I couldn't hear the usual background noise of the house. No faint ticking from the clock in the living room. No distant creaks, just the hum. I walked back to the front door and opened it again. Stepped outside. Silence. The normal world returned instantly. I turned around and looked at the house. From out there, it looked completely ordinary. No sound coming from it. No sign of anything unusual. I stepped back inside. The hum came back, exactly as before. I stood there for a long time, not moving much, just listening. At some point, I noticed the pitch shifting again, very slightly, like it was adjusting or tracking something. I took a step to the left. The sound stayed above me. I took a step to the right. Same thing. It didn't drift, didn't lag. It stayed centered. I stopped moving. The pitch settled again. I felt that tightness in my chest return. Not panic, just a growing sense that I didn't understand what was happening. I went into the living room and sat down on the couch. The hum followed. Still above, I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, staring at the floor, trying to think of anything that could explain it. Nothing fit. After a while, I stood up and went back to the door, opened it, stepped outside. Silence. I stayed there for a minute longer this time, listening to the normal sounds, grounding myself. Then I stepped back in. The hum returned, unchanged, like it had been waiting. I stood just inside the doorway, looking up at the ceiling again. The pitch shifted slightly one more time, then settled. And I realized it wasn't just that the sound stopped when I stepped outside, it was how precisely it came back. The moment I crossed into the house, like whatever it was, wasn't above the building. It was above me. We first heard it when we slowed down. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a second set of steps where there shouldn't have been any. I remember thinking it was an echo, the way sound carries weird at night out there, but it didn't line up like an echo should. It stayed with us. Jared was a few steps ahead of me on the trail, headlamp off, just using the moonlight. It was bright enough that we didn't need anything artificial, and honestly, the lights just made it harder to see beyond a certain distance. "Hold up," I said. He stopped. The other steps didn't. They continued for maybe 3 or 4 more strides, just past the point where ours had ended. Then, silence. Jared turned halfway around. "You hear that?" he asked. Yeah. We stood there, listening. Nothing came back. Just the low hum of the desert at night, if you can even call it that. It's more like the absence of noise than anything else. "That's probably someone else out here," he said. "There's no one else out here," I replied. We'd been hiking along the edge of the restricted boundary for about an hour. Not right up against the fence, but close enough that you could see it through the dark. Just a faint line running along land, broken up by posts and occasional signs you weren't supposed to ignore. No cars had passed, no other hikers, no lights anywhere. We started walking again. At first, it was just our steps, gravel shifting, the soft crunch of sand under our boots. Then, after maybe 10 seconds, it came back. Another set of steps, slightly off to our right. Parallel, same pace. I stopped again. The other steps didn't. They continued for a few more strides, just like before, then stopped. I felt that shift in my chest, the kind you get when something simple stops making sense. "Okay," Jared said quietly. "That's weird." "Yeah." We turned toward the fence line. It was about 30 yards out, maybe a little more. Hard to judge distances at night. I scanned the ground between us and it. Nothing. Just low brush, uneven patches of sand, and that thin line of fencing cutting across the landscape. "No flashlight," Jared said under his breath. "I'm not using it." We both knew better. Lights draw attention out there, even if you're technically allowed to be where you are. We started walking again, slower this time. The steps matched us, not immediately. There was always that slight delay, like whatever it was needed a moment to adjust. Then it would fall into rhythm with us. Left, right, left, right. Same spacing, same speed. I tried to focus on the direction. It sounded like it was coming from just beyond the fence, not on our side. That didn't help. "Maybe it's just someone patrolling," Jared said. "Without lights?" He didn't answer. We kept moving. After a while, I noticed something else. There was a faint glow out there. Not constant, not bright, just a subtle shift in the darkness, like something was reflecting light that wasn't there. I blinked, trying to get a clearer look. It showed up for a second, then faded, a soft, pale glow just beyond the fence line. "Do you see that?" I asked. "See what?" "There, right of that post." He squinted. "I don't... Wait." It flickered again, not like a light turning on and off, more like something moving just enough to catch the moonlight differently. "Yeah," he said. "I see it." The steps kept pace with us, steady, measured, not hurried, not cautious, just consistent. We slowed down again, the steps matched, then we stopped completely. This time, I paid closer attention. Our steps ended. The other ones didn't. They continued. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then silence. Jared let out a quiet breath. "That's not an echo," he said. No. We stood there longer this time, neither of us moving, waiting to see if anything else would happen. Nothing did. The glow didn't come back right away. The fence line stayed dark and empty. "Let's just keep going," Jared said. "Yeah." We started walking again. The steps returned, same pattern, same delay, same pace. I tried to change my speed just to see what would happen. I walked faster. The steps stayed behind for a second, then sped up to match. I slowed down. Same thing. It adjusted, like it was watching us or listening. We walked like that for another 10 minutes. The glow came and went, always faint, always just beyond where we could clearly see. At one point, I thought I saw a shape with it, something taller than the brush, thinner than a person. But it was gone before I could be sure. "Did you see that?" I asked. "Yeah," Jared said. "What was it?" "I don't know." We didn't stop that time. We just kept walking. The steps followed. At some point, we reached a section where the fence curved slightly, pulling away from the trail. The distance between us and it increased. The steps faded, not all at once, just gradually, like the sound was stretching thinner until it was gone. We stopped again, listened. Nothing. Nothing. No glow. No movement. Just the quiet. We stood there for a minute, then another. "Let's head back," Jared said. "Yeah." We turned around, started retracing our path. For the first few minutes, nothing happened, just our own footsteps again. I started to relax a little. Then, just as we got back to the point where we'd first heard it, the second set of steps came back. Right on cue. Same position. Same pace. I didn't look toward the fence this time. Didn't want to see that glow again. We didn't stop. Didn't change our speed. Just kept walking until we reached the car. When we got inside, doors closed, engine running, I finally looked out toward the fence one last time. There was nothing there. No glow, no movement. Just the same empty stretch of desert we'd seen all night. But even with the engine noise and the headlights on, I could still feel it. Like something had been walking alongside us the entire time. And only stopped because we did. I noticed it because of the reflection, not the thing itself. I was driving back late from a job out past the industrial estates, heading onto a long stretch of road that cuts through open land. My name's Ryan. It's one of those routes you take when you want to avoid traffic, just straight lines, fields on either side, hardly any lights. It was a clear night, no clouds, no fog. You could see the stars pretty well once you got away from town. I had music on low, nothing distracting. Just cruising along, doing maybe 50. That's when something caught in my headlights. Not ahead of me, above. For a split second, the light bounced off something high up in the sky. It wasn't bright, just a quick flash, like metal catching light at the right angle. I blinked and looked up through the windshield. There was nothing there, just the normal night sky. Stars. Empty. I slowed down a little without really thinking about it. My brain tried to explain it away. Maybe a bird, maybe something on a wire I didn't see. But it didn't feel like that. The angle was wrong, too high. I kept driving, eyes flicking up every few seconds. The road stayed empty. No other cars, no movement in the fields. After maybe 20 seconds, it happened again. Another brief reflection, same kind of flash. This time I was already looking in that direction. I caught more of it. Something smooth, curved. Not large, but not tiny either. Hard to judge distance. It tilted slightly, just enough to catch the beam from my headlights. Then it was gone. Not drifting out of view, not fading. It just wasn't there anymore, like it moved too fast for me to track. I slowed the car further down to about 30. My eyes stayed fixed on the sky ahead. I turned the music off. The silence in the car made everything feel sharper. The hum of the engine, the sound of the tires on the road, I kept scanning. Nothing. I told myself to just keep driving. Probably something simple. But I couldn't shake the way it had moved, or how quickly it disappeared. I drove another half-mile or so. Then something else caught my attention. The radio. It didn't cut out, but the sound shifted slightly, like the volume dipped for a second, then came back. No static, just a brief drop. I glanced at the display, still tuned to the same station, no signal warning. The sound returned to normal. I looked back at the road. Everything looked the same. Flat stretch ahead, dark fields, stars above. Then I felt it. A slight pressure in my ears, like when you change elevation quickly. It wasn't painful, just noticeable. I swallowed, trying to clear it. It didn't go away right away. At the same time, the car felt different. Not heavier, not lighter, just slightly off. Like the suspension had shifted for a moment. Then it settled again. I tightened my grip on the wheel. That same tight feeling started in my chest. Not full panic, just something building. I looked up again, trying to catch that reflection. For a few seconds, nothing. Then, just above the line of sight where the road met the sky, I saw it again. But this time, not as a reflection, a faint outline, barely visible, like a darker shape against the sky, smooth edges, curved. It wasn't blocking the stars completely, just distorting them slightly, like looking through uneven glass. I slowed almost to a stop. The car idled, the shape hung there, not moving much. Then, slowly, it tilted, just enough for the headlights to catch it again. A dull metallic sheen flashed across its surface. That confirmed it. It wasn't just my eyes, there was something there. The tilt lasted maybe half a second. Then it shifted, not sideways, not down, up, instantly. No acceleration, no gradual movement. It just snapped upward and disappeared. The stars filled the space where it had been. No trail, no sound, nothing. I sat there in the middle of the road, engine running, staring at the empty sky, waiting, listening. The pressure in my ears faded slowly. The car felt normal again. The radio stayed steady. I checked my mirrors, still no other cars, no lights in the distance. I looked back up, nothing. I stayed there for a minute or two, just watching, trying to see any sign of movement, but the sky stayed still. Eventually I started moving again, slowly at first, then picking up speed. I kept glancing up as I drove. Nothing else appeared. The rest of the drive was uneventful. By the time I got closer to town, the streetlights washed out most of the stars. Everything felt normal again. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a bit before getting out, just thinking about what I'd seen, the way it reflected the light, the way it tilted, and how it didn't move like anything I'd ever seen before. Not a plane, not a drone, not anything that follows normal motion, just there, then angled, then gone, straight upward, faster than my eyes could follow, like it hadn't been part of the sky at all, just passing through it. I noticed it in the windows before I noticed anything in the sky. I was walking home late, cutting through a residential street I don't usually take. My name's Marcus. It's a quieter road, mostly older houses spaced out a bit more than the rest of the neighborhood. No shops, no traffic that time of night. It was around 11:30, maybe a little later. The weather was dry, not cold, just still. No wind, no movement in the trees, the kind of night where everything feels a bit too quiet. I just turned onto the street when I saw it. A faint glow reflecting in the windows of the houses ahead. Not bright, just enough to catch your eye. It stretched across a few houses in a row, like something behind me, or above me, was lighting them up at an angle. At first, I assumed it was a car, maybe headlights turning onto the road behind me, but I didn't hear an engine. And the light didn't move the way headlights usually do. It stayed steady. I kept walking, slowing down slightly. The glow remained in the same place relative to the houses ahead. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. The street behind me was empty. No cars, no lights. I stopped for a second, turning fully to look back. Still nothing. When I turned forward again, the glow was still there, reflecting off the windows. Same intensity, same position. I frowned and kept walking. As I got closer, the reflections became clearer. They weren't flickering, not shifting, just a soft, dim illumination across the glass. But there was no visible source, no streetlight positioned that way, no house lights casting it. I checked the roofs, the sky above the houses. Nothing stood out. No bright object, no moving light, just darkness. I felt a slight tension in my chest. Not fear exactly, just confusion. I picked up my pace a little. The closer I got, the more obvious it became that the light wasn't coming from the usual places. It wasn't coming from the ground. It wasn't coming from the sides. It felt like it was coming from above, but not directly overhead, at an angle that didn't make sense. I stopped again, about halfway down the street. The reflections were still ahead of me, not reaching where I was standing yet. I looked up again. The sky looked normal, no clouds, stars visible, no glow. I stepped forward again, one step at a time. As I moved, the reflections seemed to stay just ahead of me, like I was walking toward them but never quite reaching them. I slowed down even more. The street felt unusually quiet. No distant cars, no dogs barking, nothing. Just my footsteps on the pavement. I took another step. The glow didn't move closer. It stayed just beyond where I was. I stopped again, waited. The reflections stayed in place. I felt something then, a slight pressure in my ears. Not strong, just noticeable, like the air had shifted slightly. I swallowed. The pressure stayed. I looked up again. Still nothing, but something felt off. I took a few more steps forward. This time, I reached the first house where the reflection had been. I looked directly at the window. There was nothing in it. No glow, no reflection, just darkness inside. I turned slightly, looking at the next house. Same thing. The glow had moved further down. Still ahead of me. I felt my heart rate pick up. I walked faster now, trying to catch up to it. But no matter how quickly I moved, it stayed just out of reach. Always one or two houses ahead. I stopped again. The pressure in my ears increased slightly. I stood still, breathing slowly. The glow didn't fade, didn't shift, just held its position. I turned in a slow circle, looking for any source. Nothing behind me, nothing above me, nothing to the sides. But the reflections were still there, ahead. I took a step forward, and suddenly, I was in it. The glow surrounded the windows on either side of me. For a brief moment, the glass lit up softly. Not bright, just enough to see. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. I blinked, standing still. The street looked normal again. Dark, quiet, no reflections, no glow. I looked up again, scanning the sky. Nothing. I listened. The usual sounds started to return. A car somewhere in the distance. A faint rustle of leaves. The pressure in my ears eased. I stood there for another minute, trying to process what had just happened. Then, I kept walking. The rest of the way home felt normal. No more lights, no more reflections. Everything looked the way it should. But I kept thinking about how the glow never had a source. How it stayed just ahead of me, like it was moving with me. And how, when I finally stepped into it, there was nothing there at all. Just empty air, and then nothing. Like whatever it was had already passed, without ever showing what caused it. I woke up because the room felt wrong. Not loud, not bright, just off. The kind of feeling you get when you open your eyes and something doesn't line up, even if you can't say what it is yet. I lay there for a second, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what had pulled me out of sleep. Then I realized it. My alarm hadn't gone off. I turned my head toward the nightstand. My phone was there, screen dark. I reached over and picked it up. The time read 7:42 a.m. I blinked, sitting up slightly. My alarm was set for 6:15. I never sleep through it. I'm a light sleeper, always have been. Even the first vibration usually wakes me up. I unlocked the phone. The alarm screen popped up like normal, except it showed dismissed 3:09 a.m. I stared at it, trying to make sense of that. 3:09. That didn't mean anything to me. I didn't remember waking up at that time. I didn't remember turning the alarm off. I checked the log again, thinking maybe I was reading it wrong. Same thing. Dismissed at 3:09 a.m. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the grogginess. Maybe I'd woken up, turned it off, and gone back to sleep. That happens sometimes, I guess. But not like that. Not 3 hours early. And I would have remembered it. At least something about it. I sat there for a minute, just holding the phone. The room felt colder than usual. Not freezing, just slightly cooler than it should have been for that time of morning. I swung my legs out of bed and stood up. The floor felt cold under my feet. I walked over to the window and pulled the curtain back. The sky was already fully lit. Normal morning, no signs of anything unusual. I let the curtain fall back into place and turned around. That's when I noticed the bedroom door. It was open, just slightly, maybe a few inches. I always close it before I go to sleep. Not all the way, but enough that it sits in the frame. Now it was cracked open wider than that. I stood there for a second, looking at it, trying to remember if I'd gotten up during the night. Nothing came back. No memory of leaving the bed. No memory of opening the door. I walked over slowly and pushed it open. The hallway looked normal. No lights on. No movement. I stepped out and checked the rest of the house. Everything was the same as I'd left it. Nothing out of place. I went back into the bedroom and sat down on the edge of the bed. Picked up my phone again, scrolled through it. No messages. No notifications from that time. Battery had dropped more than usual overnight. I'd gone to bed with about 70%. Now it was at 22%. I checked the usage. There was a gap from around 2:50 a.m. to just after 3:20. No recorded activity, just a drop in battery. I stared at that for a while, trying to think of anything that could explain it. Maybe an app running in the background, maybe something glitching, but it didn't sit right. I set the phone down and looked around the room again. That's when I noticed something else. The curtain. It was pulled back slightly more than I remembered, just enough that a thin line of light was coming through the edge. I got up and adjusted it. It slid easily, nothing stuck, nothing unusual. But I knew I hadn't left it like that. I stood there for a moment, staring at the window. Then I turned away, went into the bathroom, turned on the light. The brightness felt harsher than usual. I splashed water on my face, trying to wake myself up properly. When I looked up at the mirror, I paused. Not because of anything I saw, just because something felt delayed, like my reflection took a fraction of a second longer to match my movement. It was subtle. So subtle, I couldn't be sure. I moved my head slightly. Everything lined up, normal. I leaned closer, still normal. I stepped back. The feeling passed. I stood there for a second longer, then turned off the light and went back into the bedroom. The house felt quiet, too quiet. I picked up my phone again and checked the time. 7:51 now. Everything moving forward like it should. I sat down on the bed again, trying to piece together what had happened. But there was nothing to piece together. No memory. No clear sign of anything. Just small things. The alarm turned off hours early. The door slightly open, the curtain shifted, the battery drained. None of it added up on its own. But together, it didn't feel like nothing. I got dressed and went about my day like normal. Work, errands, everything. But I kept checking my phone more than usual, looking at the alarm log, the gap in usage. It didn't change. Still said the same thing, dismissed at 3:09 a.m. That night, when I went to bed, I double-checked everything. Set the alarm, closed the door, pulled the curtain exactly where I wanted it, plugged the phone in. I lay down and stared at the ceiling for a while before closing my eyes. I remember thinking about that time, 3:09. Trying to picture myself waking up, reaching over, turning the alarm off, but nothing came to mind. No image, no feeling, just a blank space where something should have been. Eventually I fell asleep, and for a moment, just before I drifted off, I had this strange thought that whatever happened at 3:09, it wasn't something I forgot. It was something that didn't leave anything behind, except the small changes that I only noticed afterward when everything had already gone back to normal. I noticed it when my line stopped drifting. I'd been standing there for a while, maybe 40 minutes, just casting out and letting the current do most of the work. It was early evening, that in-between time where it's not quite dark, but the light's already fading. The river ran slow where I was, but not still. You could always see it moving if you looked close enough. My name's Callum. I'd driven out to this spot a few times before. It's a stretch just past a bend, shallow near the edge, deeper toward the middle. Nobody else around that night. I'd passed one car on the way in, that was it. The air was warm, no wind, just a few insects buzzing near the reeds. Normal. I cast again, watched the line settle, and leaned the rod slightly against my forearm. That's when I noticed the water directly in front of me. It had gone flat. Not calm the way rivers sometimes look at a distance. I mean completely still, like a patch of glass. It wasn't huge, maybe 6 or 7 feet across, centered roughly where my line was sitting. Outside of it, the river kept moving like it always did. Small ripples, subtle current. But inside that circle, nothing. I frowned and leaned forward a bit. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light. The sun had dropped low enough that reflections could get weird, but when I shifted my angle, it stayed the same, perfectly smooth. I gave the rod a small tug just to see how the line reacted. The float moved slightly, but the water around it didn't ripple. It slid across that still surface like it wasn't touching anything. I straightened up slowly, looking around. The rest of the river looked normal. Same gentle movement, same sound. But where I was standing, the sound felt dampened, not gone, just quieter, like something was absorbing it. I took a step to the side. The circle didn't move. It stayed fixed in place, centered in the same spot on the water. I took another step. Same thing. It wasn't following me. It wasn't attached to me. It was just there. I crouched down a bit, trying to get closer to it without stepping into the water. The surface was so smooth it didn't even reflect properly. The sky above looked slightly off in that patch. Not distorted exactly, just less defined. I picked up a small pebble from the bank, held it over the circle for a second, then dropped it in. I expected a splash, or at least a ripple. Instead, the pebble disappeared through the surface with barely any reaction. No splash, no sound, just a faint disturbance, like something soft being pressed. Then the surface went back to being perfectly still. I stared at it, my stomach tightening. I dropped another one, same result. Outside the circle, the water reacted normally when the pebble hit. Inside, nothing. I stood up slowly. The air felt heavier, like it had thickened slightly. I became aware of how quiet everything had gotten. The insects were gone. Or maybe they were still there, just quieter. I couldn't tell. I looked up and down the river. Still empty. No movement anywhere else. Just that one circle. I stepped back from the edge a bit. The feeling in my chest wasn't fear yet, but it was getting there. More like a steady pressure. I glanced at my line again. It was still sitting inside the circle, completely still. I reeled it in slowly. As the float crossed the edge of the circle, the water reacted again. Small ripples formed immediately. Normal. I stopped reeling and let the line hang just above the surface. The circle remained unchanged. I noticed something else then. The edge of it. It wasn't sharp exactly, but it was defined. You could tell where the moving water stopped and the stillness began. And it wasn't perfectly round, slightly uneven, like it had shape but not a clean one. I took another step back. My foot crunched on gravel. The sound felt too loud. I kept my eyes on the water. The circle didn't move, didn't react, just stayed there. I felt a sudden urge to leave, not panic, just a strong sense that I shouldn't be standing there anymore. I backed up a few more steps, then turned slightly, still watching it. The trees behind me rustled faintly. The sound seemed to come back all at once. Insects, water, everything, like something had been holding it back. I looked back at the river. The circle was still there, but it looked thinner, less solid. The surface wasn't as perfectly smooth anymore. I stood there, watching. Over the next few seconds, the edges started to blur. The stillness broke apart. Small ripples crept in from the outside until the whole surface was moving again. Completely normal. Like nothing had ever been there. I waited a minute, then another. Nothing changed. Just the river flowing the way it always does. I didn't cast again. Just packed up my things and left. As I walked back to the car, I kept thinking about the way the pebble had disappeared. No splash, no sound, and how for that brief stretch of time, the water around me hadn't been behaving like water at all, just something that looked like it, until it decided to go back to normal. I woke up already alert, not like slowly coming out of sleep. I mean fully awake. Heart already beating a little faster, like I'd just been shaken or called. I didn't move at first. I just lay there on my back, staring at the ceiling. Something felt wrong. Not loud, not obvious, just wrong. My name's Darren. I live alone in a small semi-detached place at the end of a quiet street. Nothing unusual about it. Same routine most nights. Lock the doors, close the curtains, go to bed. I always close the curtains. Always. That's why it stood out. After a few seconds of lying there, I shifted my eyes toward the window. The curtains weren't fully closed. Just a small gap, maybe an inch or two. Enough for a thin line of light to come through. Street light, I remember frowning slightly, because I knew I'd closed them properly before bed. I always check. It's just a habit. I stayed still for another few seconds, listening. The house was quiet, no footsteps, no creaks. Nothing out of place, but that feeling didn't go away. The sense that something had just been there. Close, like right next to the bed. I pushed myself up slowly onto my elbows. The room looked normal. Wardrobe in the corner, chair with clothes on it, door slightly ajar like I usually leave it. Nothing out of place, but the curtains, they were definitely open. Not wide, just enough to be noticeable. I swung my legs off the bed and stood up. The floor was cold. I walked over to the window. Each step felt louder than usual. I don't know why. I reached the curtains and paused, just looking at that gap. The light coming through didn't flicker, didn't change. Just a steady line. I pulled the curtains apart slightly, looked outside. The street was empty. Same as always at that hour. A parked car a few houses down, streetlight humming faintly. Nothing moving, no one standing there. I stood there for a few seconds, scanning. Nothing. I let the curtain fall back into place, but I didn't close it yet. I turned around slowly, looked at the bed. The sheets were slightly wrinkled where I'd been lying, but something about it felt off. I stepped closer, leaning down slightly. That's when I noticed it, the pillow. It wasn't where I'd left it. It was shifted. Not a lot, just slightly angled, like someone had leaned against it. I straightened up slowly. My chest felt tight. I told myself I could have moved it in my sleep. That happens. People move around, but I don't toss and turn much. I usually wake up in the same position. I looked back at the window, the gap in the curtains, still there, still letting in that thin strip of light. I walked over and closed them properly, pulled them tight, made sure there was no gap. Then I stood there, hands still on the fabric, listening. That's when I heard it, a faint sound, above me. Not loud, just a soft, steady tone, almost like a hum. I froze. It wasn't coming from inside the room. It felt like it was above the house. I tilted my head slightly, trying to focus on it. The sound didn't change, didn't get louder or quieter, just stayed constant. I stepped back from the window. The hum stayed. Same level, same pitch. I moved toward the door, opened it slowly. The hallway was dark, quiet. The hum was still there. I walked down the stairs, each step creaking slightly. The sound felt sharper than usual. The hum didn't change. I reached the bottom, stood in the living room, listening. Still there. I walked to the front door, opened it, stepped outside. The hum stopped instantly, just gone. I stood on the doorstep, looking up. The sky was clear, no clouds, no movement, nothing above the house. I stepped back inside. The hum came back, same as before, no delay, just on. I felt that same pressure in my ears then, subtle, like being at a slightly higher altitude. I closed the door, stood there, trying to understand what I was hearing, but there was no direction to it, no source, just above. I went back upstairs slowly. The hum stayed consistent, didn't change as I moved. I went into the bedroom again. The curtains were still closed, exactly how I'd left them. I stood there for a minute. Then, without thinking, I stepped over to the window again, pulled the curtains open slightly, looked out, nothing. Same empty street, same still air. I let the curtain fall back, closed it again, and as soon as I did, the hum stopped. I stood there, waiting, listening, nothing. The pressure in my ears faded. The house went quiet again. I didn't sleep much after that, just lay there staring at the ceiling, listening for that sound to come back. It didn't, but when I woke up in the morning, the curtains were slightly open again, same gap, same thin line of light coming through, and I knew I hadn't touched them after closing them the second time. I noticed it because the dashboard went dim before anything else changed. Not off, just dimmer, like someone had turned the brightness down a notch without touching anything. I was driving back from visiting my sister. She lives out past a stretch of open farmland, nothing but long, flat fields and the occasional fence line. No houses for miles in some parts. It was late, maybe just after midnight. The road was empty, no street lights out there, just my headlights cutting through and the sky above. My name's Aaron. I've done that drive plenty of times, so I know how the car usually feels at night. The dashboard lights, the faint glow from the center console, even the way the interior reflects a bit on the windshield. It's all familiar. That's why I noticed it right away. I was about halfway through the open stretch when the interior lights dipped. Subtle, but obvious. The radio display, the speedometer, even the little indicator lights, everything just softened for a few seconds. My first thought was electrical. Battery, maybe. I glanced down at the dashboard. Everything looked normal. No warning lights, no flickering, just dimmer. Then I looked up, and the sky looked wrong. Brighter. Not like dawn, not like moonlight, just lighter than it should have been. The clouds, if there were any, weren't visible, but the darkness itself felt thinner, like the black had been lifted slightly. I slowed down a bit without thinking. The road ahead stayed the same, headlights cutting through, but above, it felt like there was more light than there should be. I checked the mirrors, nothing behind me, no car lights, no distant glow, just darkness. I looked back at the dashboard, still dim. The same reduced brightness. I reached over and adjusted the dial that controls it. It didn't respond, stayed at that lower level. Then, just as suddenly as it had changed, it came back. The interior lights returned to normal brightness, the radio display sharpened, The instrument panel lit up the way it always does, and at the same time, the sky went back to normal. Dark, flat, no strange brightness. I drove a bit further, heart rate slightly up, but nothing too extreme. Told myself it was probably just a brief electrical dip, maybe something with the alternator. But it didn't sit right. I kept going. A few miles down, it happened again. This time, I noticed the sound change first. Not completely, just slightly muffled, like the engine noise had softened. Then the lights dimmed again. Same level as before, consistent, not flickering, just lowered. I looked up immediately. The sky had that same brightness, subtle, but unmistakable. The kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. But I was. I slowed down more this time, almost to a crawl. The road stretched ahead, empty. The fields on either side were just dark shapes. But the sky, it felt closer. That's the only way I can describe it. Like it wasn't as far away as it should be. I opened the window slightly. Cold air rushed in. The sound outside didn't change. Still quiet. Still nothing unusual. I stepped on the brake and came to a full stop in the middle of the road. The car idled. The interior lights stayed dim. The sky stayed brighter. I sat there, looking up through the windshield. For a second, I thought I saw something move. Not across the sky, more like within it. A slight shift in the brightness. Then it stopped. The lights inside the car came back. Full brightness. The sky returned to normal. Just like before. I sat there for a while, engine running, not moving, trying to decide if I should get out, but something about the way it felt kept me in the seat, like stepping out wouldn't help. I started driving again, a bit faster this time, just wanting to get through that stretch. The rest of the road felt normal, no more dimming, no change in the sky, everything behaved exactly how it should. By the time I reached the next small town, I'd almost convinced myself it was just a glitch with the car. Maybe the electrical system dipped for a moment, maybe my eyes adjusted weirdly. Something explainable. But then I noticed something else. When I pulled into a lit area and parked, I checked the dashboard settings. The brightness dial hadn't moved, still set where I always keep it, and the car didn't show any sign of battery issues, no warning lights, no errors, nothing. A few nights later, I drove that same road again, same time, same conditions. Nothing happened. Everything stayed normal. But now, every time I hit that open stretch, I pay attention to the lights, the sound, the sky. Because when it happened, it wasn't just the car dimming. It was like something outside got brighter, and the car adjusted to it for a moment, before everything went back to how it's supposed to be. I noticed it because the sky didn't brighten the way it's supposed to. I was already awake. Couldn't sleep, so I'd gone downstairs and made coffee, then ended up standing by the back door looking out over the fields behind the house. It's pretty open where I live, just a long stretch of land with a few hedges and nothing blocking the horizon. My name's Owen. I've lived here a few years, so I know exactly how the light usually comes in before sunrise. It's gradual. You get that faint glow along the horizon, then it spreads, lifting everything out of the dark evenly. That morning, it didn't. At first, I thought I was just early. The sky was still dark, but not fully. That gray-blue tone had started to creep in, the kind that tells you dawn's close. I took a sip of coffee, just watching it. Then I saw the first patch. It wasn't on the horizon, it was higher up. A soft area of brightness, maybe the size of a large cloud, but there weren't any clouds there. It didn't look like light shining through something. It looked like the sky itself was brighter in that spot. I frowned and leaned closer to the glass. The rest of the sky stayed the same. Dark, even, consistent. But that one area was lighter. I waited, expecting it to spread. It didn't. It just stayed there. Then another patch appeared, off to the right this time. Same kind of brightness, same size, roughly. Not connected to the first one. Just separate. I set the mug down on the counter and opened the door. Stepped outside. The air was cold, still. No wind at all. I looked up. Now there were 3 patches, each one faintly glowing, none of them touching, none of them moving like clouds. They weren't drifting, they weren't expanding, just existing. I walked a few steps out into the yard. The grass crunched slightly under my shoes from the cold. I kept my eyes on the sky, trying to figure out what I was looking at. Maybe thin cloud cover catching early light? But the horizon was still dark. There was no source for the light yet. No gradual increase from one direction. just those isolated areas. Then one of them dimmed. Not faded slowly, just reduced, like someone had turned the brightness down. It didn't disappear completely, just became less noticeable. The others stayed the same. I turned slightly, tracking them. Another one appeared, further left. Same kind of glow, same size. Now there were 4, spread out unevenly across the sky. I tried to see if there was any pattern, any alignment. There wasn't. They looked random, but they all had the same intensity, the same soft, diffuse edge. I noticed then that the ground hadn't changed. The fields were still dark, the hedges were still silhouettes. None of that light was reaching down. It was only in the sky. I stepped further out, away from the house, trying to get a wider view. The patches stayed in place. They didn't follow me, didn't shift relative to my position. They were fixed in the sky. Then one of them moved, not across the sky, just repositioned, like it blinked into a slightly different spot. There was no motion between the 2 points, no trail, just there, then there. I blinked a couple of times, thinking I'd imagined it, but then another one did the same thing, a small jump. Not far, but enough to notice. That's when it started to feel wrong. Not just unusual, wrong, because nothing in the sky moves like that. Not clouds, not light, nothing. I stood there watching, my breath visible in front of me now. The patches stayed for a while longer, then one by one they started to dim. Not all at once, individually, each one fading at a slightly different pace. The first one I'd seen was the last to go. It lingered longer than the others, still faintly glowing while the rest had nearly vanished. Then it too dimmed, until the sky was back to a uniform gray-blue. The horizon began to brighten normally after that, slow, even spread of light. Exactly how it should be. I stayed out there until the sun actually came up, watching the sky carefully. Nothing else happened. Everything looked normal. But the thing that stuck with me was how separate those patches had been. Like the sky wasn't lighting up as a whole, just in pieces. And whatever caused it, it didn't follow the usual direction of sunrise. It just stopped before it became one. I noticed it with my eyes closed. I'd already settled in for the night, lights off, phone on the nightstand, just lying there trying to fall asleep. It was quiet in the house. No TV, no music, just the usual low creaks you get when everything cools down. My name's Joel. I live alone, small place, nothing unusual about it. That night felt completely normal up until that point. I had my eyes closed, just waiting for sleep to come, when I saw the flicker. It wasn't bright, just a faint flash, like distant lightning behind your eyelids. Soft, quick, gone almost immediately. I opened my eyes. The room was dark, no light coming through the curtains, no cars passing outside, nothing. I stayed still for a second, listening. No thunder, no rain, nothing that would explain it. I closed my eyes again, just to see if it would happen a second time. I waited. 10 seconds, maybe 20. Nothing. I opened them again. Still just darkness. I shifted slightly in bed, adjusting the pillow, telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe just something with my eyes, like when you see random flashes sometimes. I closed my eyes again. Another few seconds passed. Then something else caught my attention. A faint sound. Not loud, just subtle, like something tapping lightly somewhere in the house. I kept my eyes closed, trying to pinpoint it. It stopped. I opened my eyes again. The room looked the same. I turned my head slightly, looking toward the door. Closed, no light under it. I listened. Nothing. I rolled onto my back and stared at the ceiling. There was just enough ambient light from outside to make out the outline of things, the wardrobe, the chair in the corner. Everything looked normal. I reached over and checked my phone. 2:17 a.m. No notifications, no missed calls. I put it back down and lay there, trying to settle again. After a minute or so, I closed my eyes. No flicker this time, just darkness. I exhaled slowly, starting to drift. Then I felt something. Not a touch, just a slight shift in the air, like the room had changed pressure slightly. It was subtle, but enough to make me open my eyes again. I sat up a bit this time, propping myself on my elbows. The room looked the same, but something felt off. Hard to explain. Just a sense that something wasn't quite right. I listened again. No tapping, no movement, nothing. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and sat there for a moment. The floor felt colder than usual under my feet. I stood up and walked over to the window, pulled the curtain back slightly. The street outside was empty. No cars, no lights moving. The sky was clear, no clouds, definitely no storm. I let the curtain fall back into place, turned around and looked at the room again. Everything where it should be. Nothing disturbed. I stood there for another minute, then got back into bed. Pulled the covers up, tried to relax. I kept my eyes open this time, staring at the ceiling. After a while, I closed them again. Still nothing. No flicker, no sound. Just darkness. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep. But something else bothered me in the morning. When I woke up, my phone wasn't where I'd left it. It was still on the nightstand, but closer to the edge, like it had been nudged, not fallen. Just moved. I picked it up and checked it. Battery was lower than it should have been. I'd gone to bed with around 60%. It was down to 18%. No apps running, no calls, no messages. I checked the usage. There was a gap from around 2:15 to just after 3. No recorded activity, just a drop in battery. I stood there for a second staring at the screen. Then I put it back down. The rest of the day went on normally, nothing else strange. But that night, when I went to bed, I caught myself hesitating before turning the light off, just thinking about that flicker. How it looked exactly like distant lightning, except there was no storm, and how it only happened once. Like something far away or something I couldn't see, briefly showed up just enough to register before disappearing again, without leaving anything behind to prove it was ever there at all. I first noticed the humming when I crossed the second block. It was late, close to 1 a.m., and I'd gone out for a walk because I couldn't sleep. I live in a quiet suburb outside Boise, the kind of place where everything shuts down early and the streets are empty by midnight. My name's Daniel. I walk a lot at night when my head won't settle. That night was cold but clear, no wind. Just that still kind of quiet where your footsteps sound louder than they should. I had my hands in my jacket pockets, hood up, just walking with no real direction. At first, I thought the humming was coming from a house. It was faint, low, more like something you felt than heard. I kept walking. The sound stayed with me. Not louder, not quieter, just there. I slowed down a little, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It didn't seem directional. Usually you can tell if a sound is coming from your left or right, ahead or behind. This wasn't like that. It felt centered, like it was around me instead of somewhere else. I stopped walking. The humming stopped immediately. I stood still for a second, listening. Nothing. Just the normal silence of the street. I took a step forward. The humming came back. Same volume, same tone. That made me pause. I took another step. Still there. I stopped again. Silence. I frowned, looking around. The houses were dark, no lights on, no cars moving, no obvious source. I turned slowly in a circle. Nothing changed. I took a few steps backward. The humming came back again, exactly the same. I stopped. It stopped. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Then I kept walking, a little slower now, paying attention. The humming followed, not in a way that suggested movement behind me or above me. It didn't get closer or farther. It just stayed consistent, like it was locked to my pace. I tried walking faster. The sound didn't change. Still the same low, steady tone. I slowed down again. Still there. I stopped abruptly. The silence hit instantly. No fade, no delay, just gone. I felt that tight, uneasy feeling settle in my chest. I looked up. The sky was clear, stars scattered across it. Nothing unusual. I looked back down the street, still empty. I kept going, but now I was paying attention to everything. The sound of my shoes on the pavement, my breathing, the faint hum of distant power lines, but this humming was different. It wasn't part of the environment. It was attached. That's the only way I can describe it. I turned onto a side street that runs along a small park. There's a stretch there with no streetlights for about half a block. It gets darker than the rest of the neighborhood. I hesitated for a second, then kept walking. As soon as I stepped into the darker stretch, the humming changed slightly. Not in pitch, in presence. It felt stronger, not louder exactly, just more noticeable, like it was pressing in closer. I slowed my pace. The sound stayed with me. I stopped. Silence. I took a single step forward. The humming returned instantly. I looked around again. The park to my right was just a dark mass of trees, no movement, no light. I took another step, then another. The sound didn't shift, didn't move, just stayed constant. I started to feel like I was being matched, not followed, matched. I stopped again. The silence felt heavier this time, like something had been there and suddenly wasn't. I took a breath and turned around, started walking back the way I came. The humming came back, same as before, perfectly synced to my movement. I tested it, short steps, long steps, it didn't matter. The sound was there as long as I was moving, gone the second I stopped. I picked up at my pace, walking faster now. The sound stayed with me. I crossed back under a streetlight. The orange glow spread across the pavement. My shadow stretched out in front of me. For a second, I thought the humming dipped, not stopped, just softened. Then it returned to normal. I kept walking, almost at a jog now. The sound didn't lag, didn't fall behind, didn't get ahead. It stayed perfectly in sync. I reached the corner near my house, stopped. Silence. I stood there, breathing a little heavier, looking around. Everything looked normal. The same houses, the same quiet street. I took one step forward. The humming came back, right away. That's when it really hit me. It wasn't following me. It wasn't coming from somewhere else. It was reacting to me. I walked the last half block to my house quickly. The sound stayed with me the entire time. I reached my driveway, stopped. Silence. I stood there for a second, staring at the front door. Then I took a step toward it. The humming came back. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, closed it behind me. The sound stopped, completely. I stood there in the entryway, not moving, listening. Nothing. Just the quiet of the house. I took a step forward, still nothing. I walked into the living room. No humming. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Everything felt normal again, but something about it stuck with me. I walked over to the window and looked outside. The street was empty, still, quiet. I stared for a minute. Then I unlocked the door again, opened it just a few inches. The cold air slipped in. I stepped 1 foot outside. The humming came back immediately. Same tone, same intensity. I froze, then pulled my foot back inside. Silence. I closed the door, locked it. Stood there for a long time just staring at it. Eventually, I went to bed. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, everything felt normal. No sound, no weirdness. But later that day, when I stepped out to get the mail, I paused on the porch, just for a second, listening. There was nothing at first. Then, as I shifted my weight forward to take a step, I felt it, not heard, felt. A faint vibration in my chest, like something was about to start. I saw the light before I realized how wrong it looked. I was driving home from my sister's place, out past the edge of town where the road cuts between open farmland for miles. It was late, close to 11, and completely dark, except for my headlights and the occasional distant farmhouse light way off in the distance. My name's Aaron. I'd taken that road plenty of times. That night was clear, no clouds, just a flat black sky and rows of crops on both sides. Corn mostly, tall enough that you couldn't see far into the fields. I was maybe 10 minutes from home when I noticed something off to my right. At first, I thought it was a porch light from a house set back in the field, but it wasn't in the right place. It was too low and too far from any structure. It hovered just above the tops of the crops, a soft white glow, not bright, more like a dull, steady light. I slowed down a little, trying to get a better look. The glow didn't move. It just stayed there, hanging over the field. I checked the road ahead, then glanced back at it. Still there. Same height, same brightness, no flicker, no beam, just a shape of light. I rolled down my window a bit. The night air came in, cool and still, no sound, no hum, nothing. I slowed down more, almost to a crawl. The light didn't react, didn't shift, didn't change intensity. It just stayed fixed in place. I tried to make sense of it, maybe a piece of equipment in the field, some kind of marker light, but it didn't illuminate anything around it. The crops directly beneath it were still dark. That's what made me notice something was off. If it was a normal light, it should have cast something. A glow, a shadow, anything. But the field looked exactly the same under it. I pulled the car onto the shoulder. Gravel crunched under the tires. I left the engine running. The headlights pointed down the road, leaving the field mostly in darkness except for that one spot. I leaned slightly toward the passenger side, trying to get a clearer view. The glow hovered maybe 10, 15 feet above the crops. Perfectly still. No sway, no drift. I turned off the headlights. The road ahead went dark. The only light left was that one glow in the field. It didn't get any brighter without the headlights. Didn't seem affected at all. I opened the door and stepped out. The night felt heavier outside the car, quiet in a way that made every small movement stand out. I stood there watching it, trying to understand what I was looking at. It didn't look like a bulb or a flame or anything I recognized, just a soft, round presence of light. I took a step away from the car. The gravel shifted under my shoe. The sound felt too loud. The light didn't move. I took another step. Still nothing. No reaction. I felt that tightness in my chest start to build. Not panic, just that sense that something wasn't right. I stopped walking, stood there, staring. Then the light changed. It didn't flicker, didn't brighten. It just started to move, upward, straight up. No curve, no tilt, just rising, slow at first, then a little faster, still completely silent. I felt my body tense. The way it moved didn't look natural. No wobble, no adjustment, just a smooth, controlled lift. I took a step back without thinking. The light kept rising. It didn't cast anything on the ground, didn't change the look of the crops below it. It was like it existed separate from everything around it. Within a few seconds, it was above the height of the field, then higher, above where a tree line would be if there were trees. I kept watching, my eyes tracking it against the sky. It didn't get smaller as fast as I expected, which made me realize it was probably farther away than it looked, or bigger. I couldn't tell. It kept going, straight up, no sound, no trail, no change in brightness. Then, just as it reached a point where it blended into the stars, it disappeared. Not faded, not dimmed, just gone. 1 second it was there, the next, nothing. I stood there, staring at the empty space, waiting for it to come back. Nothing did. The sky looked normal again. Stars scattered evenly, no movement. I stayed there longer than I meant to, trying to convince myself I'd misread it, that it was something normal I just didn't recognize. But the way it had risen, I couldn't explain that. Eventually I got back in the car, closed the door. The inside felt smaller than before, quieter. I turned the headlights back on. The road lit up again. The field to my right looked completely normal. Dark, still, no sign of anything. I pulled back onto the road and started driving. For a while, I kept checking the side mirror, then the sky, then back to the road. Nothing. Everything stayed normal. About 5 minutes later, I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 11:42. That made me frown. I was sure it had been closer to 11:20 when I first saw the light. It hadn't felt like 20 minutes, more like 5. I drove the rest of the way home without stopping. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a second before turning off the engine. The house was dark, quiet, normal. I got out, locked the car, and walked inside. But before I closed the door, I looked back down the street. Just for a second, everything was still. But way out past the last streetlight in the direction of the fields, I thought I saw something faint. Not bright enough to be sure, just a pale suggestion of light, hovering low, exactly where I'd seen it before. I noticed the ladder before I even had my coffee. It was early, still kind of gray outside. Not fully light yet, just that flat morning light that makes everything look washed out. The grass was damp, and there was a bit of mist hanging low over the yard. I opened the back door to let some air in, and that's when I saw it. The ladder was out, leaning against the side of the house, right below the upstairs window. I stopped in the doorway for a second. I kept the ladder in the shed. Always had. It was one of those things I didn't move unless I needed it, and I definitely hadn't needed it recently. I walked out onto the patio, still trying to wake up, thinking maybe I'd just forgotten using it. But the angle it was leaning at didn't make sense. It was set carefully, not just dropped there. The feet were planted evenly on the grass, the top resting just under the window frame like someone had positioned it properly. I stood there, looking up at the window. Closed. Nothing out of place. I looked back at the ladder. There was no mud on it. No sign it had been dragged across the yard. It looked like it had just been picked up and set there. I checked the shed. Door still latched. Nothing disturbed inside. I came back out and stood next to the ladder again. That's when I noticed the grass. A patch about 6 or 7 feet across, just off to the side of where the ladder stood. It wasn't flattened. Not exactly. It looked off. Slightly darker than the surrounding grass, like it had been pressed or warmed or something. The edges of it were soft, almost circular, but not perfect. I walked over to it. The ground felt normal under my feet. Not soft, not burnt, just different looking. I crouched down and touched the grass. It was damp like the rest, but the color didn't match. It had a faint dullness to it, like it had lost some of its green. I stood back up and looked around the yard. Fence was intact, gate still closed, no footprints I could see, no sign anyone had been in there. I lived alone. No one else had access to the yard. I went back inside and grabbed my phone, checked the time. 6:18. I tried to think back to the night before. I'd gone to bed around midnight. Nothing unusual. I hadn't heard anything during the night. No noise, no movement outside. I went upstairs and checked the window. The ladder was leaning under. Still locked. No marks on the frame. No sign it had been opened. I went back downstairs and stood in the kitchen, looking out at the yard again. Something about the whole thing felt wrong, but I couldn't pin down exactly what. I made coffee, trying to shake it off. Figured maybe I just moved the ladder and forgot. It didn't feel likely, but it was the easiest explanation. I left the ladder where it was and got ready for work. Before I left, I stepped out again to take one more look. The yard was brighter now with the sun coming up. The discolored patch was more obvious in the daylight. Still faint, but definitely there. The ladder hadn't moved. Everything else looked normal. I locked up and left. At work, I didn't think about it much at first, just busy with everything. But around mid-morning, I checked the time on my phone and noticed something. It said 10:07. The wall clock in the office said 9:42. I frowned. I figured one of them was off. I checked another clock, 9:42. I looked back at my phone, 10:07, exactly 25 minutes ahead. I stared at it. That didn't make sense. I restarted my phone thinking it was just a glitch. When it came back on, it synced to the correct time. 9:43. I shrugged it off, but something about that number stuck with me. 25 minutes. When I got home later that day, the ladder was still there. Same position. Nothing had changed. I walked out into the yard again. The patch of grass was still visible. Maybe slightly more faded now, or maybe I was just focusing on it more. I stood in the middle of it, looking up at the sky. Nothing unusual. Clear. Quiet. I walked over to the ladder and grabbed it, pulled it away from the house. It felt normal. Just a ladder. I carried it back to the shed and put it inside. Closed the door, latched it. Then I went back out and stood in the yard again. I don't know why, just stood there. The air felt still, heavier than usual. Not enough to really notice unless you were paying attention. I looked down at the grass where the circle had been. For a second I thought I saw something shift. Not the grass itself, just the way the light hit it, like the air above it moved slightly. I blinked. It looked normal again. I went inside. That night, I kept waking up. No noise, no reason, just waking up. At one point, I checked the time, 2:11. I rolled over and went back to sleep. The next time I woke up, it was morning. Alarm going off, 6:30. I got up, went downstairs, and opened the back door again. The ladder was back, leaning in the exact same place, same angle, same position under the window. I just stood there in the doorway, not moving. The shed door was still latched. I walked over slowly, checked it. Still closed, still locked. I turned back to the yard. The circular patch was there again, slightly darker than the rest. Same size, same shape. I checked my phone, 6:31. Then I looked at the clock on the wall inside, 6:06. I didn't reset anything that time. I just stood there looking out at the yard, trying to remember if I'd gone outside during the night. But I couldn't remember anything at all between checking the time at 2:11 and waking up to the alarm. And the ladder was already back where I hadn't left it. I cut through the school lot because it was quicker than going around the block. It was a big open space, mostly empty at night, with a fence along the far side and a few scattered light poles that didn't do much except leave long gaps of darkness between them. That night it was just after midnight. I'd finished a late shift and didn't feel like taking the longer route home. It was dry, but cold, the kind of cold where the air feels thin and everything carries a little farther than usual. You could hear your own footsteps clearly on the asphalt. I stepped into the lot from the side entrance, hands in my pockets, head down slightly. At first, everything felt normal. The hum from the distant road, a faint rustle from somewhere near the trees beyond the fence, the occasional creak from the metal basketball hoop near the far corner. I walked about halfway across before I noticed the light. It was ahead of me, near the fence, not from a pole, not from any fixture I could see. It was a narrow beam, straight down from above like a column, maybe 3 or 4 feet wide, white but not harsh, contained. It lit up a small circle on the ground and nothing beyond it. I slowed down without meaning to. The beam didn't move, it just stayed there, fixed in place. I stopped walking. Inside the light, dust and leaves were drifting upward. Not falling, rising, slowly like they were being pulled towards something above. I stared at it, trying to figure out what I was looking at. There was no visible source. I looked up, nothing above it. Just the dark sky, no helicopter, no drone, nothing. I took a few steps closer. The sound of my footsteps felt muted, like it wasn't echoing the way it should. I stopped again, maybe 10 or 15 feet from the edge of the light. The leaves inside it continued to lift off the ground, one at a time, drifting upward and disappearing as they reached the top of the beam. I watched one in particular. It lifted slowly, rotated slightly, then just faded out as it reached the upper edge. I blinked. The beam didn't change. The rest of the parking lot felt darker now. Not visually, just quieter. I realized I couldn't hear the distant road anymore. No cars, no wind, nothing, just silence. I shifted my weight. My ears popped. Suddenly, I swallowed. The pressure stayed. I took a breath. It felt heavier than it should have. Not difficult, just noticeable. I looked around the lot, still empty. No one else there. No movement beyond the beam. I looked back at it. For a second, I thought I saw something inside the light. Not a shape, just a distortion, like the air wasn't sitting right. Then it smoothed out again. The leaves kept rising. The beam pulsed once, soft. The pressure in my chest increased slightly. I brought one hand out of my pocket and rubbed my fingers together. They tingled, faintly, like static. I took another step forward. The moment I did, the sound dropped even further. The silence deepened. It felt like everything had been turned off. Even my own breathing sounded distant. The beam didn't react to me. It stayed steady. The circle of light on the ground looked flat, too flat, like the texture of the asphalt had been pressed down. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to decide whether to get closer or back away. My body felt slightly off. Not weak, just delayed. Like there was a fraction of a second between deciding to move and actually moving. The beam pulsed again, stronger this time. The pressure in my ears spiked. I winced. The leaves inside it lifted faster for a second, then returned to their slow drift. I took a step back. The pressure eased slightly. I took another step back. My hearing started to come back just a little, a faint hum in the distance. I looked down at the ground near my feet. It looked normal. Then I looked back at the beam. For a split second, I thought I saw something pass through it, not from below, from above, like a shadow crossing through the light. Then it was gone. The beam flickered once, and then it disappeared. Just like that. No fade, no dimming. Gone. The leaves that had been drifting upward dropped all at once, falling normally now, hitting the ground with soft, scattered sounds. And for a few seconds, everything was completely silent. Not just quiet, silent. No distant road, no wind, no ambient noise at all. I stood there, frozen, listening. Then the sound came back, all at once. Cars in the distance, a faint breeze, the creak of the basketball hoop again. I exhaled slowly. I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath. I looked at the spot where the beam had been. The asphalt looked slightly different, duller, like it had lost some of its texture, but it might have just been the angle. I took a step toward it. Everything felt normal again. No pressure, no heaviness, just cold air and the usual night sounds. I walked the rest of the way across the lot without stopping. When I reached the other side, I pulled my phone out of my pocket. The screen lit up. 1:18. I frowned. That didn't feel right. I was sure it hadn't been that late when I entered the lot. It hadn't felt like more than a couple minutes had passed. I kept walking, checking the time again a few steps later. 1:19. It moved forward normally, no glitches, no jumps, but there was a gap I couldn't account for. And when I looked back over my shoulder at the parking lot, everything looked completely normal. Dark, empty, like nothing had been there at all. The irrigation pumps shut off before the sky changed. I worked nights on a large farm in eastern Colorado during harvest season. The owner had dozens of irrigation rigs spread across miles of fields, and someone had to monitor the pumps overnight to make sure everything stayed running. Most of the work was quiet. I sat in a small metal shed near the center of the property watching pressure gauges. and occasionally driving out to check equipment if something looked wrong. My name's Ethan Rowe. I'd been doing the night shift there for about 2 months. It was around 2:30 in the morning when the first pump stopped. Normally, when a pump shuts down, you hear it wind down slowly. This one didn't. The motor noise just disappeared. I looked out the window of the shed toward the field where the pump sat. The irrigation rig, one of those long metal arms on wheels, had stopped moving. Then the next pump went silent, and the one after that. Within about 10 seconds, the entire line of irrigation rigs across the field had frozen in place. I stepped outside. The air felt strange. Not cold exactly, just heavy. The wind that usually swept across the open fields had completely stopped. The rows of corn stood perfectly still. Even the leaves weren't moving. Then I noticed the sky. A wide patch of stars above the field looked warped. They weren't gone. They were bending, like the light from them was being pulled toward the center of something invisible. The distortion drifted slowly across the sky above the irrigation rigs. As it moved overhead, the metal towers of the rigs began making faint clicking sounds, like the frames were adjusting under pressure. The distortion stopped directly above the center of the field. For a moment, the ground lit up faintly, not bright like a spotlight, just a pale glow spreading across the corn rows and the dirt between them. The irrigation arms cast faint shadows across the field. I could see the entire farm clearly for a few seconds. Then the glow vanished. The distortion shot forward across the sky and disappeared toward the horizon faster than anything I'd ever seen. The wind returned instantly. The corn began rustling again. The irrigation pumps restarted one by one. The rigs began slowly turning across the field like nothing had happened. Everything returned to normal, except for the car. A black sedan sat parked beside the dirt access road at the edge of the property. I hadn't heard it arrive. 2 men stood beside it. Both wore black suits, white shirts, black ties. No jackets, even though the night air across the fields had turned cold again. One of them was tall with dark hair combed straight back. The other had a broader build and pale skin that looked almost gray under the moonlight. They were watching the irrigation rigs. The tall one walked toward me. "You observed the passage," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," I replied slowly. "What was that thing?" The shorter man glanced up toward the sky. "A transit object," he said. "That thing bent the stars." "Yes." The way he said it made my stomach tighten. "So you know what it was?" Neither of them confirmed it. Instead, the tall man looked back toward the irrigation rigs slowly turning across the field. "You also noticed the pump interruption," he said. "They all shut off. That's common during those events." "For what events?" He didn't answer. The shorter man stepped closer to the field and ran his hand across a corn leaf. "You're the only worker on site tonight," he said. "How do you know that?" "We checked the farm schedule." That response made me uneasy. "You guys from the agriculture department or something?" I asked. "No." "Military?" "No." "Then who are you?" The tall man paused before answering. "We observe unusual crossings." "Crossings of what?" He looked up toward the sky again. "Things that move through this region." "That's not helpful." "It's accurate." The wind pushed through the corn again, making the field whisper softly. I looked back toward the horizon where the distortion had vanished. "So what exactly flew over this farm?" The 2 men exchanged a quick glance. Then the shorter one said quietly, "Something traveling far beyond this place." The tall man stepped back toward the sedan. "You should log the pump shutdown as a routine power fluctuation," he said. "That's not what caused it. It will be the explanation that remains." I folded my arms. "What happens if that thing comes back?" He paused before getting into the car. Then he said softly, "It doesn't repeat the same crossing." Both men got into the sedan. The engine started quietly. As the car rolled down the dirt road away from the farm, the shorter man lowered the window. "You lost about 30 seconds during the passage," he said. "I was standing here the whole time." Time compresses near certain events. The sedan disappeared into the dark farmland. Later that morning, when I checked the irrigation logs, every pump had shut down for exactly 30 seconds. But according to the timestamp, that interruption started nearly a minute before the first pump ever stopped. I noticed the light before I realized it wasn't coming from the horizon. I was already awake, sitting on the back steps with a cup of coffee, waiting for sunrise. It was something I did sometimes when I couldn't sleep. My place sits on the edge of a small town in eastern Oregon, with open land stretching out behind it. No houses, no roads, just fields and low brush. The sky was still dark, but that deep blue right before morning. You could tell the sun was close, even if it hadn't broken yet. I was looking out across the land, expecting that slow, even brightening along the horizon. Instead, I saw a line, a narrow vertical line of light. It cut straight up from the horizon like someone had drawn it there. At first, I thought it was something in my eyes, a reflection from the cup, maybe. I blinked a few times. The line stayed. It was faint at first, pale white, but clearly defined. Not spreading sideways like normal sunrise light, just rising straight up. I leaned forward slightly. The air was still cold, the kind that settles overnight and hasn't burned off yet. No wind, no sound except for the faint hum of something distant. The line got brighter, not quickly, just enough that I could see it more clearly against the sky. It was maybe a few degrees wide, stretching from the horizon. The rest of the sky stayed the same, dark blue, unchanged. I stood up slowly, the wooden steps creaked under my feet. I stepped out into the yard to get a better view. The grass felt damp. I kept my eyes on the line. It didn't flicker, didn't spread, just held that shape, a vertical column of light. I tried to tell myself it was something normal, a plane maybe, or a reflection from something far away, but it didn't move like anything I recognized. It didn't travel across the sky. It didn't widen. It just existed. I checked my watch, 5:11 a.m. That seemed about right for sunrise. But the light wasn't behaving like sunrise. I looked to either side of the line. The horizon was still dark. No gradual glow, no color change, just that one vertical strip. Then I noticed something else. The edges of the line were sharp, not perfectly crisp, but defined enough that you could see where it stopped. It wasn't blending into the sky. It was separate from it. I took a few steps forward, even though there was nowhere to go. The open land stretched out in front of me. Flat, empty. The line remained fixed. I held my breath for a second, without meaning to. Then the light changed, not in brightness, in direction. It started to retract. The bottom of the line lifted off the horizon, slowly, like someone was pulling it upward. I blinked, trying to process what I was seeing. The lower edge of the light moved up, leaving darkness behind it. The top stayed where it was. For a second, it looked like the line was shortening from the bottom. I felt that tightness in my chest again, the same kind I'd felt before when something didn't make sense. I stepped back slightly. The light continued to retract, smooth, controlled, no flicker, no change in intensity, just lifting. Within a few seconds, the bottom half was gone. The line was shorter now, floating above the horizon. I glanced around quickly. The rest of the sky still hadn't changed. No sunrise, no color, just darkness in that single column. I looked back at it. The retraction continued. The line grew shorter and shorter. Then, when it was only a small segment high in the sky, it paused, just for a second, perfectly still. I could see it clearly now against the darker blue. A narrow, pale strip. Then it moved again, upward, faster this time. Not a sudden jump, but quicker than before. Within a second, it reached higher into the sky. Within another, it was just a small, bright dash. Then it was gone. Not fading, not dimming, just gone. I stood there staring at the empty space where it had been. The sky looked normal again, just that pre-dawn blue. Then, slowly, the actual sunrise began. A faint glow spread along the horizon. Soft, even, exactly the way it's supposed to. I checked my watch again, 5:17 a.m. That made me pause. It hadn't felt like 6 minutes, more like maybe 1 or 2. I tried to think back through what I'd just seen, how long the line had been there, how long it had taken to retract. It didn't match the time. I stood there until the sun started to come up for real. The light spread across the horizon like it always does. Nothing unusual, no vertical line, no strange movement, just morning. Eventually I went back inside, set the cup down on the counter. The house felt normal, quiet in a familiar way. But when I glanced out the window again, just before turning away, I thought I saw something faint high in the sky. A thin, pale streak, too brief to focus on. Gone the moment I tried to look directly at it. I woke up already aware of it. Not from a sound, not from a dream, just this immediate, quiet certainty that I wasn't alone in the room. My eyes opened slowly, like I didn't want to move too fast and confirm it. The room was dark. The only light came from the digital clock on my dresser, casting a faint red glow across the wall. 2:46 a.m. I stayed completely still, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, no movement. But the feeling didn't go away. It wasn't panic. It was more focused than that, like my attention had been pulled in one direction, toward the window. I sleep with the bed positioned so I can see it without turning my head. It's on the left side of the room, about 6 feet away, with thin curtains that let a little streetlight through at night. I looked at it. The curtains hung still. No movement. No shadow passing behind them. Everything looked normal. But the feeling stayed. I shifted slightly under the blanket, testing if the movement would trigger anything. Nothing happened. Still quiet, still. I told myself it was just one of those things. Waking up halfway through a sleep cycle, brain still in that alert state. But then I noticed the air. It felt warmer near the window, not dramatically, just enough to register. The rest of the room was cool. I always keep the thermostat low at night. But that side, it felt different. I sat up slowly. The mattress creaked faintly under my weight. I waited. Nothing changed. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up. The floor was cold. I took a step toward the window. The warmth became more noticeable. Still subtle, but real, like standing near a vent that was barely on. I stopped about 2 feet away from the curtains. My chest felt tight again, the same way it does when something doesn't add up. I listened carefully. The apartment was quiet. No traffic outside. No noise from neighbors. Even the usual hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen seemed distant. I reached out and touched the curtain. The fabric felt normal, cool. I slid it slightly to the side. The window was closed, locked. I checked the latch just to be sure. Still secure. Outside, the street was empty. A single streetlight illuminated the sidewalk and part of the road. No one standing there. No cars passing. Nothing. I leaned closer to the glass. The warmth felt strongest right near the window. I held my hand up, palm facing it. There was definitely a difference, like heat was radiating from the other side. That didn't make sense. It was cold outside. I'd checked the weather earlier. Low 40s. There was no reason for the window to feel warm. I pulled my hand back slowly. The warmth faded as I stepped back. 2 steps away, the air felt normal again. I stood there, looking at the window, trying to decide what to do next. Part of me wanted to open it, to check, but something about that idea felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, just not something I should do. I stayed there for another, just watching. Nothing moved. The curtain hung still. The glass reflected a faint outline of my room behind me. Then for a second I thought I saw something in the reflection. Not outside, inside, a darker shape behind me. I turned around immediately. The room was empty. Bed, dresser, chair in the corner, nothing else. I turned back to the window. The reflection looked normal now, just the room. I stepped back again. The warmth near the window seemed to fade slightly. Not completely, but less noticeable. I checked the time again, 2:52 a.m. That made me pause. It felt like maybe a minute or two had passed, not 6. I tried to replay what I'd just done, standing up, walking over, checking the window. It didn't feel like it had taken that long. I went back to the bed and sat down. The feeling of being watched hadn't fully gone away. It had just shifted. Less focused now, more spread out. I lay back down slowly, keeping my eyes on the window. The room stayed quiet. Nothing moved. After a few minutes, my eyes started to feel heavy again. I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up in the morning, everything felt normal. Sunlight came through the curtains. The room was the same as always. I got up and walked over to the window again. The glass felt cold. Normal. No warmth. No difference in the air. I unlocked it and opened it slightly. Cold air came in, exactly what I expected. I stood there for a minute, letting it settle. Then I closed it again. Later that day, I checked something without really thinking about it. The inside of the glass, there were faint marks. Not fingerprints exactly, more like smudges. On the outside, I could see them when the light hit at the right angle. They weren't there before. I would have noticed. They were higher than I could easily reach from outside without a ladder. I stared at them for a while. Then I wiped them away. That night when I went to bed, I left the curtains slightly open, just enough to see the window clearly. I lay there in the dark, staring at it, waiting. Nothing happened for a long time. The room stayed quiet, the air stayed cool. Eventually, my eyes started to close, and just before I fell asleep, I felt it again. That same slight warmth, right near the window. I felt it before I saw anything. Just a quick vibration through the seat, like someone had lightly kicked the underside of the car. I was parked in a grocery store lot, engine off, waiting for my brother Caleb to come out. It was around 9:40 p.m., late enough that the place had mostly emptied out, but not completely dead. A few cars were still scattered around. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting that dull white glow over everything. I had my phone in my hand, scrolling, not really paying attention to anything. Then the seat shifted under me. Just once. Not strong. Not enough to move the car, but enough that I felt it clearly through my back. I looked up immediately. My first thought was someone had tapped the bumper or something. I checked the side mirrors. Nothing. No car pulling out. No one walking behind me. The lot looked the same as it had a second ago. Quiet. Still. I sat there for a moment, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. I exhaled and leaned back slightly, telling myself it was probably just the car settling or something. Then I glanced at the rearview mirror. That's when I saw the glow. It was faint, barely there. A soft patch of light hovering behind the car, maybe 20 or 30 feet back. Not bright enough to light anything up, just enough to stand out against the darker asphalt. I straightened up. The glow didn't move. It didn't flicker. Just hung there. I turned my head and looked directly out the back window. Nothing. Just the empty parking lot. A row of carts near the entrance. A couple of cars farther out. No light. I looked back at the mirror. The glow was still there. Same spot. Same faint intensity. I frowned and leaned closer to the mirror, adjusting the angle slightly. The glow shifted with it, stayed centered in the reflection. I turned around again, this time pressing my face closer to the glass to see if I was missing something. Still nothing. No light source, no reflection from another car. Just darkness. I sat back slowly. My chest felt a little tight. I looked at the mirror again. The glow remained. I reached up and dimmed the mirror slightly, thinking maybe it was some kind of glare. The glow stayed exactly the same. I turned my head side to side, watching how the reflection changed. Everything else in the mirror shifted normally, the light poles, the parked cars, but the glow stayed fixed, like it wasn't tied to the scene behind me. I swallowed. Then the glow dimmed, just a little, not disappearing, just becoming harder to see. I leaned forward again, trying to keep it in view. For a second, it looked like it stretched slightly, not in shape, but in how it spread, like it wasn't a solid thing. Then it faded completely. Gone. I stared at the mirror. Nothing there now, just the normal reflection of the lot. I sat there for a few seconds, trying to process it. Then I checked the time on my phone. 9:52 p.m. That made me pause. I was sure it had been around 9:40 when I first felt the vibration. I tried to think back. How long I'd been sitting there. How long I'd been looking at the glow. It didn't feel like 10 minutes, more like a minute or two. I looked up at the store entrance. Still no sign of Caleb. I glanced back at the mirror. Nothing. Everything looked normal again. A car drove past a few rows over. The headlights swept across the lot, reflecting briefly in my mirror. Completely different from what I'd seen. Sharp. Defined. Gone as soon as the car passed. I leaned back again, trying to relax. My hands felt a little tense on the steering wheel. Then, just as I was about to pick up my phone again, I felt it. Another vibration. This one softer. More like a hum than a jolt. It lasted maybe a second. Then stopped. I froze. My eyes moved slowly to the rearview mirror. Nothing. No glow this time. Just the empty lot. I turned around again, looking out the back window. Still nothing. I exhaled slowly. Then I noticed something else. The lot seemed quieter, not silent, but quieter than it should be. The overhead lights still buzzed faintly, but I couldn't hear any cars moving. No distant engines. Nothing. I looked around. Everything appeared normal, but the sound felt muted. I checked my phone again. 9:53 p.m. Only a minute had passed. I stared at the screen for a second, then I locked it and set it down. A few seconds later, I saw Caleb walking out of the store. He had a bag in one hand, looking down at his own phone as he crossed the lot. I watched him approach in the mirror. Completely normal. No glow behind him. No distortion. Just him. He opened the passenger door and got in. "Sorry, line was longer than I thought," he said. I nodded. "Did you feel anything just now?" I asked. "Like what?" I hesitated. Like the car moving or something. He shook his head. No. Why? Nothing, I said. He shrugged and set the bag down. I started the engine. The car came to life normally. I checked the mirror one last time before putting it in reverse. For a split second, I thought I saw it again, that faint glow, right where it had been before. Then it disappeared as the car began to move. I noticed the line because it didn't match anything in the room. I was lying on my back, staring at the wall across from my bed. It was late, probably past 2 a.m. I hadn't checked the time in a while, but I couldn't sleep. Just one of those nights where your brain won't shut off. My room faces the backyard. There's a small window with blinds, and usually you get a little bit of streetlight bleeding through from the side, just enough to see shapes. But this wasn't that. This was a thin line, straight, faint, but clearly there. It stretched vertically along the wall, about a foot wide, like a narrow beam of light that had been flattened. At first, I thought maybe a car had turned down the street and the headlights were catching the window at a weird angle. But it wasn't moving the way headlights do. It was too slow. I stayed still, watching it. The line crept sideways across the wall, not jittery, not flickering, just a steady, smooth motion, like it was being dragged across the surface. I pushed myself up slightly on my elbows. The room stayed quiet, no sound of a car passing, no engine, no tires on pavement, nothing. Just that line of light, moving. It reached the corner where the wall meets the ceiling. Then it continued upward. That's when it started to feel wrong. Light doesn't usually behave like that. If it was coming through the window, it should have stretched and distorted as it climbed. But it didn't. It kept the same shape, same width, same intensity, like it wasn't coming from outside at all. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, but didn't stand up yet, just sat there, watching. The line slid onto the ceiling, still straight, still even. It moved slowly across the ceiling now, heading toward the center of the room. I glanced at the window. The blinds hadn't moved. No shifting shadows, no passing light from outside. I looked back at the ceiling. The line was still there. Still moving. I stood up this time, slowly, like I didn't want to disturb anything. The floor felt cold under my feet. I took a few steps closer, standing directly under it. The light didn't react. Didn't change brightness, didn't flicker. It just kept going. I reached up slightly, not touching it, just holding my hand near where it passed. There was no warmth, no sensation at all. It wasn't like standing in sunlight or under a lamp. It felt like nothing. That made it worse. I pulled my hand back. The line continued moving. It crossed over the center of the ceiling now. Then it started to fade. Not all at once, gradually, like someone was dimming it. The edges softened first, then the brightness dropped. Within a couple seconds, it was gone. The room went back to how it had been before. Dark. Still. I stood there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to come back. Nothing did. I walked over to the window and pulled the blinds up slightly. Outside was quiet. The backyard was dark. No lights, no cars. Nothing that could have caused it. I let the blinds fall back into place, turned around. The room looked normal again, but something felt off. I couldn't explain it. I got back into bed, but stayed sitting up, listening, trying to catch any sound I might have missed. After a minute or two, I checked my phone. 2:14 a.m. That seemed about right. Maybe a little later than I expected, but close enough. I set it down on the nightstand. Then I noticed something else. The room smelled different, faint. Almost like after a thunderstorm, that sharp, clean smell. I sat there, trying to place it. It wasn't strong, just enough to notice. I got up again and walked toward the window. The smell seemed stronger near it. I pulled the blinds back again. Still nothing outside, just darkness. I opened the window slightly. Cool air came in, normal air, no smell. I closed it again, turned back toward the room. That's when I saw it again. Not on the wall, on the floor this time. A faint line near the foot of the bed. I froze. It was the same shape, same width, same soft glow, but it wasn't moving. Not yet. I didn't move either, just watched. After a few seconds, it started to shift, slowly, sliding across the floor, toward the wall. I took a step back. My heart was beating faster now. The line reached the base of the wall, then climbed, same as before. No distortion, no change in shape, just moving upward. I felt that tightness in my chest again, that sense that something was happening just outside of what I could understand. I looked at the window again. Still nothing, no source, no explanation. I turned back. The line had reached halfway up the wall. Then it stopped. Just for a second, completely still. Then it dimmed, faster this time. Within a second, it was gone. The room was dark again. I stood there, not moving, waiting. Nothing came back. After a while, I got back into bed. I didn't lie down right away, just sat there, staring at the wall where it had been. Eventually, I checked my phone again. 2:26 a.m. I frowned. That didn't make sense. It hadn't felt like 12 minutes, maybe 3 or 4. I set the phone down slowly, lay back, closed my eyes. I didn't fall asleep right away. I kept thinking about the way the light moved, too steady, too controlled, and how it didn't seem to come from anywhere. At some point, I must have drifted off, because when I woke up, it was morning. Sunlight coming through the window normally. Everything looked fine, but when I got up and looked at the wall across from my bed, there was something I didn't recognize at first. A faint, straight mark, barely visible, running vertically, exactly where the light had first appeared. I was working patrol just before 2 in the morning when this happened. It was late August, warm and quiet out, the kind of night where the air feels completely still and you can hear insects in the fields from the road. I had been a police officer for about 11 years by then, and most of my patrol area covered the farmland and small back roads outside town. Dispatch called me about a report of a strange light near a large irrigation field along County Road 14. The caller was a farmer who lived on the edge of the property. He said he had stepped outside to check on his irrigation pump and noticed a bright object hovering over the center of one of his fields. At first, he thought it might be a helicopter flying low over the crops, but he told dispatch it had been sitting there several minutes, and he couldn't hear any sound coming from it. I was about 8 minutes away, so I told dispatch I'd head over. The road leading to the farm runs through a long stretch of open fields with very little lighting. As I got closer, I noticed a glow rising above the cornfield ahead of me. It was a bright white light hovering low over the crops. When I pulled onto the dirt access road that ran alongside the field, I could see the object clearly. Hovering above the center of the field was a circular object with a bright ring of white light underneath it. The light illuminated the tops of the corn and a section of the irrigation system running across the field. I parked the cruiser near the edge of the field and stepped out. The object appeared maybe 25 or 30 feet across and was hovering about 40 feet above the crops. The upper part of it looked dark against the night sky. The strange thing was the silence. Even standing there in the open farmland where sound normally carries far, I couldn't hear any engine noise or rotor blades. Something hovering that low should have made a lot of sound. This thing made none. I walked a little closer toward the edge of the field to get a better look. While I was watching it, the object drifted slightly. It moved maybe 10 or 15 feet sideways across the field in a smooth motion and then stopped again. There was no tilt or wobble like a helicopter would have. It just glided through the air. I pulled out my radio to call dispatch and report what I was seeing. The moment I pressed the transmit button, the radio filled with loud static. I tried again, same result. At the same time, a faint humming sound began to fill the air. It was low and steady, almost like distant electrical equipment. The ring of light underneath the object grew brighter. The tops of the corn beneath it started bending outward in a circular pattern as if something was pushing air downward. I remember feeling a faint vibration through the ground beneath my boots. Then the object began to descend, slowly. It dropped maybe 10 feet closer to the crops before stopping again. The humming sound deepened slightly. For a moment, it just hovered there. Then the light dimmed suddenly. The humming rose in pitch, and without warning, the object shot straight upward. The speed was unbelievable. 1 second it was hovering above the field, the next it was already high above the farmland. Within 2 seconds it had become a small bright point climbing into the sky. Then it disappeared completely. The humming stopped instantly. My radio cleared up at the same moment. Dispatch came through asking if I had attempted to transmit earlier because they had received a burst of interference from my unit. I stood there looking up at the empty sky for several seconds before answering. Backup arrived about 10 minutes later. By that time, the field looked completely normal again. We walked into the area where the object had been hovering. The corn in the center of the field had been bent outward in a rough circular pattern about 20 feet across. Other than that, there was nothing unusual. No debris, no burn marks. Later that morning, the report was filed as an unidentified aerial object observed hovering above the irrigation field before ascending rapidly out of sight. A few days later, we were informed that no aircraft had been operating in that area during the sighting. I've handled plenty of strange calls during overnight patrol over the years. Most of them eventually turn out to have simple explanations. But that night out in the cornfield is one incident I've never been able to explain. Even now, when I drive past that same stretch of road during late patrol, I sometimes slow down and glance across the field. Most nights, it's completely dark and quiet there. But every once in a while, I still catch myself looking up at the sky above the crops, wondering if that silent white light might appear there again. The first thing that felt wrong was the wind. I was driving back from a late shift at a warehouse outside Des Moines, taking the farm roads to avoid highway construction. It was a little after 1 in the morning. The area was flat farmland, miles of cornfields and gravel roads with the occasional farmhouse light in the distance. Normally, the wind moves constantly across those fields. You hear it through the stalks, a low rustling sound that never really stops. That night, it suddenly went quiet. I had my window cracked open and noticed the silence right away. The air still felt cold, but the sound of the fields moving was gone. I slowed the truck slightly and looked out across the rows of corn. The stalks had stopped moving, completely, even though the clouds above were still drifting across the stars. That's when the headlights dimmed. Not off, just weaker. The gravel road ahead looked duller, like someone had lowered the brightness on everything. I thought maybe the battery was going bad. Then I looked up. A section of the sky directly ahead looked strange. The stars weren't disappearing exactly. They looked stretched, like someone had pulled them slightly toward the center of an invisible shape. The distortion drifted slowly across the sky over the cornfields. It didn't look solid, more like the air itself had thickened into a faint outline. As it moved overhead, my truck radio went silent. No static, just dead air. The dashboard lights flickered. The engine coughed once. For a moment, the entire road felt darker, even though the headlights were still on. The shape stopped above the road about 50 yards ahead of me. The stars behind it bent inward again, more noticeably this time. Then the cornfields lit up, not bright like daylight, just a pale white glow spreading across the tops of the stalks. I could see the rows of corn clearly for a few seconds, as if light was shining down from something huge above them. Then the glow vanished. The distortion shot forward across the sky so fast I barely followed it before it disappeared. At the same moment, the wind came back. The corn started rustling again. The radio blasted music through the speakers. The headlights brightened. Everything went back to normal, except for the car parked ahead. A black sedan sat on the shoulder of the road about 20 yards in front of my truck. I hadn't seen it there before. 2 men stood beside it. Both wore black suits, white shirts, thin black ties. No coats, even though the wind across the open farmland had turned cold again. One of them was tall and narrow with slick dark hair. The other was heavier with pale skin that almost looked gray under my headlights. They didn't wave or signal. They just stood there watching me. I slowed down and rolled the truck to a stop a few feet away. The tall one stepped toward my window. "You observed the disturbance," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Yeah," I replied slowly. "What was that thing?" The shorter man glanced up toward the sky where the distortion had disappeared. "A passing object," he said. "That's not helpful." The tall one gave a faint smile. "Objects pass overhead all the time. Not ones that bend the stars." Neither of them argued. Instead, the shorter man leaned slightly toward the window. "Your vehicle experienced interference during the event." "My radio died." "That's normal." "For what?" He didn't answer. The tall man looked across the cornfields. "You were the only vehicle on this road when it occurred," he said. "How do you know that?" "We checked." The wind pushed through the corn again, making the field hiss softly. I stared at both of them. "You guys from the government?" "No." "Military?" "No." "Then who are you?" The tall man paused before answering. We monitor unusual passages. Passages of what? He looked up at the sky again. Things that don't remain in one place very long. That answer made the back of my neck tighten. So that thing wasn't supposed to be here. Neither man confirmed it. Instead, the shorter one stepped back toward the sedan. You should continue driving, he said calmly. That's it? That's it. I hesitated. What happens if it comes back? The tall man looked at me for a long moment. Then he said quietly, it won't return along this road. Both men got into the sedan. The engine started without much noise. The car turned around on the gravel shoulder and drove off into the dark fields. Within seconds, the taillights disappeared over the next hill. I sat there for another minute before pulling away. The cornfields looked normal again. The wind sounded normal. But when I glanced up at the sky once more, one small patch of stars still looked slightly bent, like something enormous had just passed through and hadn't quite finished leaving. The highway camera froze right before the lights showed up. I worked overnight traffic monitoring for a small county department in western Colorado. Most of my shift involved watching live feeds from roadside cameras and logging accidents or weather conditions. It was usually quiet after midnight, long stretches of highway with almost no cars moving through the mountains. My name's Kyle Hartman. I'd been doing the job for about a year when this happened. It was around 2:10 in the morning. Snow had fallen earlier that evening, so the roads were mostly empty. I had 6 camera feeds open on the monitor wall, all showing different sections of highway winding through the foothills. One of the feeds suddenly froze. Not the whole system, just that one camera. The image showed a stretch of road climbing through a narrow canyon. Pine trees on both sides, snow piled along the shoulder. I tapped the keyboard to refresh the feed. Nothing changed. The cars that had been moving on the screen stayed frozen mid-frame. That's when I noticed the sky in the camera view. The stars above the canyon looked warped, not hidden by clouds. They looked stretched, like something invisible was drifting across them. The distortion moved slowly across the frozen image. That made no sense because the camera feed itself wasn't moving, yet the stars inside the frame were shifting slightly. Then the monitor flickered. The entire screen went dark. A second later, every other camera feed dropped out too. The room lights dimmed slightly. The computer fans slowed to a quiet hum. The building felt strangely still. I stood up and walked over to the window that overlooked the parking lot outside the office. The sky above the mountains looked exactly like the camera had shown. A wide ripple stretched across the stars. It moved slowly across the valley. The stars bent inward toward the center of the shape. Like the sky had softened, the ripple passed directly overhead. For a moment, the streetlights outside the building dimmed. Even the snow on the ground looked darker. Then the distortion shot forward across the sky and disappeared behind the mountains. Everything returned instantly. The streetlights brightened. The computers restarted. The camera feeds came back online. I walked back to the monitors. The Canyon camera was working again, but the timestamp in the corner had jumped ahead 3 minutes. No glitch message. No outage alert. Just a clean gap. I was still staring at it when headlights appeared outside. A black sedan rolled into the parking lot and stopped near the entrance. 2 men stepped out. Both wore black suits, white shirts, black ties. No coats, even though the night air outside had dropped below freezing. One of them was tall with narrow features and slick, dark hair. The other was broader with pale skin that looked almost gray under the parking lot lights. They walked inside like they already knew where they were going. The tall one approached the desk. "You observed the sky distortion," he said. It wasn't phrased like a question. "Yeah," I replied slowly. "What was that thing?" The shorter man glanced at the monitor wall. "A temporary atmospheric phenomenon," he said. "That's not what it looked like." The tall one gave a faint smile. "Most atmospheric events appear unusual at night." The cameras shut down. "Yes." For 3 minutes. He tilted his head slightly. "Closer to 2. I frowned. "How would you know that?" The shorter man pointed at the canyon feed. "Your system clock jumped forward," he said. "That's what I'm saying." "No," he replied quietly. "It corrected itself." That sentence didn't make sense. I looked from one of them to the other. "You guys from the state or something?" "No." "Then who are you?" The tall man didn't answer. Instead, he studied the frozen frame on the canyon camera. "You noticed the distortion before the outage," he said. "Hard to miss." He nodded. "Most drivers didn't." "Drivers?" "The vehicles on that highway." My stomach tightened. "You're telling me that thing passed over the road?" The two men exchanged a brief glance, then the shorter one said calmly, "It crossed several areas." "What was it?" He didn't respond. Instead, the tall man stepped back from the desk. "You should log the camera interruption as a routine signal failure," he said. "That's not what happened. It's the explanation that will remain." I crossed my arms. "You still haven't told me who you work for." The tall man paused at the door. Then he said quietly, "We track unusual movement." "Movement of what?" He looked up toward the dark mountains outside. "Things that don't always stay where they should." Both men walked back to the sedan. Before getting in, the shorter one looked back at the building. "You won't see that distortion again," he said. "How can you be sure?" He paused for a moment. Then he answered, "Because it already left this part of the sky." The sedan drove out of the lot and disappeared down the dark road. When I reviewed the camera logs later, the canyon feed showed no sign of the distortion at all. Just 3 minutes missing from the recording, and the stars in the sky looking perfectly normal before and after. The bridge lights went dark before the river changed. I worked overnight security at a small river crossing in eastern Pennsylvania. It wasn't a big highway bridge, just a narrow 2-lane span over the Susquehanna with a small control shack where someone stayed overnight to monitor traffic and the drawbridge controls for barge traffic. My name's Ryan Calder. Most of my shifts were quiet. After midnight, the only vehicles that passed through were truckers and the occasional late commuter. The river usually made constant noise under the bridge. Water hitting the support pylons, wind moving across the surface. But that night, something strange happened around 2:05 a.m. The river went quiet, not gradually. One moment I could hear the water moving under the bridge. The next moment, like someone had turned the volume down on the entire river. I stepped outside the control shack and looked over the railing. The current looked slower. Not stopped exactly, but moving in a strange, smooth way like the surface had flattened. Then the bridge lights flickered. The row of yellow lamps running along the guardrail dimmed slightly. I looked up. A section of stars above the river looked wrong. They weren't hidden, they were bent. The light from them curved slightly toward the center of a wide shape, drifting across the sky. The distortion moved slowly along the length of the river. As it passed overhead, the bridge lights dimmed again. The hum from the electrical box inside the shack faded. The air felt heavier. For a few seconds, the entire bridge seemed quieter than anything I'd ever heard. Then the distortion stopped directly above the river. The water beneath it began to glow faintly. Not bright, just a pale white shimmer spreading across the current. The glow lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then the distortion shot forward across the sky and vanished behind the hills. The river noise returned instantly. The current resumed its normal churning sound. The bridge lights brightened again. Everything returned to normal, except for the car. A black sedan sat parked near the entrance to the bridge. I hadn't heard it arrive. 2 men stood beside it. Both wore black suits, white shirts, black ties. No coats despite the cold air coming off the river. One of them was tall with dark hair slicked straight back. The other had a broader build and pale skin that looked almost gray under the bridge lights. They were watching the river. The tall one walked toward me. "You observed the disturbance," he said. It wasn't phrased like a question. "Yeah," I replied slowly. "What was that thing?" The shorter man glanced up at the sky. "A passing object," he said. "That thing bent the stars." "Yes." The way he said it made my stomach tighten. "So you know what it was." Neither of them confirmed it. Instead, the tall man looked down at the river again. "You also noticed the water movement change," he said. "The current looks slower." "That's common during those events." "For what events?" He didn't answer. The shorter man stepped closer to the bridge railing and watched the dark water moving below. "You're the only person stationed here tonight," he said. "How do you know that?" "We reviewed the bridge schedule." That response made me uneasy. "You guys from the State Department or something?" I asked. "No." "Military?" "No." "Then who are you?" The tall man paused before answering. We monitor unusual passages. Passages of what? He looked up toward the sky again. Things that move through this region. That's not helpful. It's accurate. The wind moved across the river again, sending small ripples through the water. I looked back toward the stars. So what exactly passed over this bridge? The two men exchanged a quick glance. Then the shorter one said quietly, "Something traveling along a route far beyond here." The tall man stepped back toward the sedan. "You should log the light fluctuation as routine electrical interference," he said. "That's not what caused it. It will be the explanation that remains." I crossed my arms. "What happens if that thing comes back?" He paused before getting into the car. Then he said softly, "It doesn't travel the same crossing twice." Both men got into the sedan. The engine started quietly. As the car rolled off the bridge toward the empty highway, the shorter man lowered the window. "You lost about 40 seconds during the passage," he said. "I didn't go anywhere." Time compresses slightly near those events. The sedan disappeared down the road. I stood there listening to the river for a while before going back inside the shack. Later that morning, when I checked the bridge control logs, the system showed a 40-second interruption in the electrical feed. But according to the timestamp, that interruption happened almost a minute before the bridge lights ever flickered. I was working patrol a little after 2:05 in the morning when this happened. It was early February, cold and clear outside, the kind of night where everything feels quiet and the sound of your own tires on the road seems louder than usual. I had been a police officer for about 11 years by then, and most of my patrol area covered the rural roads outside town. Dispatch called me about a report of a strange light near the old county water tower that sat on a hill just outside town. The caller was a man who lived in a house at the bottom of the hill. He said he had stepped outside to take out some trash when he noticed a bright object hovering near the top of the tower. At first he thought it might be a helicopter flying low over the area, but he told dispatch it had been there several minutes and he couldn't hear any sound coming from it. I was only about 5 minutes away, so I told dispatch I'd head over and take a look. The road leading up the hill toward the water tower is narrow and lined with trees on both sides. As I got closer, I noticed a glow above the tree line near the top of the hill. It was a bright white light hanging low in the sky. When I reached the small gravel lot at the base of the tower, I could see the object clearly. Hovering just above the top of the water tower was a circular object with a bright ring of white light underneath it. The light illuminated the top of the tower and part of the ground around it. I parked the cruiser and stepped out. The object appeared maybe 25 feet across and was hovering about 20 feet above the tower. The upper part of it looked dark against the sky. The strange thing was the silence. Even standing there on the hill where sound normally carries easily, I couldn't hear any engine noise or rotor blades. Something hovering that low should have made a lot of sound. This thing made none. I walked a little closer toward the fence surrounding the tower to get a better look. While I was watching it, the object drifted slightly. It moved maybe 10 feet sideways above the tower in a slow, smooth motion, and then stopped again. There was no tilt or wobble like you'd expect from a helicopter. It just glided through the air. I reached for my radio to call dispatch and report what I was seeing. The moment I pressed the transmit button, the radio filled with loud static. I tried again. Same result. At the same time, a faint humming sound began to fill the air. It was low and steady, almost like distant electrical equipment. The ring of light underneath the object grew brighter. The metal surface of the tower reflected the light strongly enough that the entire top of the structure looked illuminated. Then the object began to descend, slowly. It dropped maybe 10 feet closer to the top of the tower before stopping again. The humming sound deepened slightly. For a moment, it just hovered there. Then the light dimmed suddenly. The humming rose in pitch, and without warning, the object shot straight upward. The speed was unbelievable. 1 second, it was hovering above the tower. The next, it was already far above the hill. Within 2 seconds, it had become a small, bright point climbing into the sky. Then it disappeared completely. The humming stopped instantly. My radio cleared up at the same moment. Dispatch came through asking if I had attempted to transmit earlier, because they had received a burst of interference from my unit. I stood there looking up at the empty sky for several seconds before answering. Backup arrived about 10 minutes later. By that time, the hilltop looked completely normal again. We checked the area around the tower where the object had been hovering. The loose gravel on the ground had been pushed outward in a rough circular pattern about 20 feet across. Other than that, there was nothing unusual. No debris, no burn marks. Later that morning, the report was filed as an unidentified aerial object observed hovering above the county water tower before ascending rapidly out of sight. A few days later, we were informed that no aircraft had been operating in that area during the sighting. I've responded to plenty of strange calls during overnight patrol over the years. Most of them eventually turn out to have simple explanations. But that night on the hill by the water tower is one incident I've never been able to explain. Even now, when I drive past that same road during late patrol, I sometimes slow down and look up toward the tower on the hill. Most nights, the sky above it is completely empty. But every once in a while, I still catch myself scanning that spot, wondering if that silent white light might appear there again. I was working the evening shift at a grain elevator outside Hutchinson, Kansas, when this happened. Not the huge industrial kind you see from the highway, but big enough that everyone in town knew it. 4 tall storage bins, 1 older concrete elevator, a scale house, and a gravel lot that turned into mud every time it rained. This was in late September, right after harvest started slowing down. The days were still warm, but evenings cooled off fast once the sun dropped. That night had been clear and dry with a hard orange sunset behind the fields. I was the last one there. That wasn't unusual. I handled cleanup, checked augers, locked the scale office, and made sure the access hatches on the bins were secured before leaving. My supervisor, Dale, always made a big deal about that because kids from town had climbed the bins a few years earlier and almost got themselves killed. By around 8:15 p.m., the lot was empty except for my pickup. The farmers were gone. Dale had left an hour before. The scale house lights were still on, but everything beyond them was turning dark. The place always made noises after sunset. Metal bins ticking as they cooled, belts settling, grain shifting inside like faint rain. I was used to it. That night, though, the noises stopped. That was the first thing I noticed. I was sweeping around the loading pit when the whole elevator seemed to go quiet at once. No settling grain. No insects in the weeds near the fence. No distant highway hum either, even though the highway sat less than a mile away. I stopped sweeping and listened. Nothing. Then one of the lights over the loading bay flickered. Just once. I looked toward the power pole, thinking maybe we were about to lose electricity, but the scale house stayed lit. The yard light above the office buzzed normally. I finished sweeping faster after that. I locked the shop door, checked the south gate, and started my last walk around the bins. The biggest bin sat at the far end of the property, near a row of dry sunflowers along the ditch. It had a ladder running up the side and a small access hatch near the roof. I always checked that hatch from the ground with a flashlight. You could see if the latch had been disturbed because it hung just below the roof lip. That was when I saw the glow. At first, I thought the moon had come out behind the bins. There was a soft white light above the storage tanks, just higher than the roofline. Not bright enough to cast sharp shadows, more like fog lit from inside. But the sky was clear. No moon in that direction, no clouds. The glow hovered above the bins without making any sound. I stood there with the flashlight hanging in my hand, not even pointed at anything anymore. My first normal thought was drone. Somebody messing around after dark. Kids, maybe, but I couldn't hear propellers. And it didn't blink or move, it just hung there. The metal wall of the nearest bin started ticking, soft at first. Tick, tick, tick. That sound wasn't unusual by itself. Metal ticked when it cooled, but then the second bin started, then the third, then all 4 storage bins were ticking together in this slow, uneven rhythm. It sounded like rain hitting tin, except there was no rain. The glow stayed above them. I remember backing up a step because the sound seemed to come from every side at once. Not loud, just constant and close. The air smelled strange too. Not grain dust, not diesel. Something sharper. Hot metal mixed with wet dirt, even though the yard was bone dry. I clicked my flashlight off without thinking. The glow didn't change. It was brighter than I wanted it to be, and at the same time not bright enough to explain anything. The sides of the bins didn't shine the way they should have. The metal only caught faint pale streaks along the curves. I took out my phone to call Dale. No signal. That wasn't completely crazy out there, but usually I could get one bar near the office. I walked back toward the scale house holding the phone up like an idiot. Still nothing. Behind me, the ticking got faster. Not much, just enough that I noticed. I turned around. The glow looked lower. I don't mean I saw it descend. It was just lower than it had been a few seconds earlier. Now it seemed to hover between the tops of the bins instead of above them. A pale white shape, blurry around the edges. I could not see any object inside it clearly, but there was a darker center, like something solid was wrapped in light. That was the moment I stopped trying to explain it as a drone. The scale house door was maybe 30 yards behind me. I started walking toward it without taking my eyes off the bins. The gravel under my boots sounded wrong, too soft, like I was walking on packed dirt instead of rock. The ticking continued. Then the old concrete elevator made a deep hollow knock, one time, from high up. I froze. Another knock came from the metal stairwell attached to the side. Then another from inside the loading spout. Knock, knock, knock. Not random settling. It moved downward. The sound traveled through the structure slowly, from the top of the elevator to somewhere near the ground. I turned and walked faster toward the office. The yard light above the scale house flickered twice. The glow between the bins brightened. At the same time, every shadow in the lot seemed to lean toward it. I know that sounds dramatic, but I don't know how else to describe it. The poles, the fence, the auger frame, even my own shadow stretched the wrong way for a second, like that glow was pulling light out of the yard instead of giving it off. Then my radio clipped to my belt made a burst of static. We used cheap handhelds around the elevator, mostly for directing trucks during busy days. Mine should have been quiet because everyone had gone home. The static hissed for 3 or 4 seconds. Then a voice came through. Not Dale, not anyone I knew. It was low and broken, buried under crackling noise. I couldn't make out words, but it had the pattern of someone talking calmly from far away. I grabbed the radio and pressed the button. Who is this? The static stopped. The ticking stopped too, all at once. The silence hit so hard I felt pressure in my ears. The glow remained. I stood there halfway between the bins and the scale house, holding the radio in one hand and my dead phone in the other. Then something moved on the ladder of the big bin. I saw it only because it crossed the pale light. A darker shape near the upper rungs. At first I thought it was a person climbing down. That was where my brain went immediately, because what else would a shape on a ladder be? I yelled, "Hey, you need to get down from there." No answer. The shape didn't climb. It seemed to hang against the ladder for a second, too long, too thin. Then it slipped sideways around the curve of the bin and disappeared from sight. The ticking started again, this time only from the big bin. Faster. Tick, 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 tick. I backed up until my shoulder hit the scale house door. I nearly dropped my keys getting it open. Inside, everything looked normal. Fluorescent light buzzing overhead, desk covered in scale tickets, coffee cup in the sink, Dale's old calendar on the wall. I locked the door behind me and stood there breathing hard. Through the window facing the bins, I could still see the glow. It hovered lower now, almost level with the top catwalk. I picked up the landline. Dead. No dial tone. That scared me worse than the phone because the office line almost never went down. It was old copper, separate from whatever cell service did. I set the receiver back carefully. Then I noticed the clock on the wall. 8:22. I checked my wristwatch. 8:22. That helped for about half a second. Then the wall clock's second hand stopped. My watch kept ticking. The fluorescent light above me dimmed slowly until the office turned gray. The glow outside brightened in response. The windows began to vibrate faintly in their frames, not rattling from wind. A hum, low and steady. It came up through the floor, through the desk legs, through my boots. I looked down and saw dust moving across the tile in thin lines toward the door. Grain dust, dirt, tiny flakes of dried mud from people's boots. All of it slid slowly in one direction, toward the bins. I backed away from the window. Something tapped the glass. I did not move. Another tap came. Light. Careful. From outside. The window sat high enough that no person could tap it without standing on something. I stared at the glass. A pale streak appeared there, right at eye level. Not a handprint. More like condensation forming from the outside in 3 narrow lines. Then the glow outside vanished. Complete darkness returned around the bins. The office lights snapped back to full brightness. The wall clock started moving again. The landline made one short chirp, like it had reset itself. For a second, I almost believed it was over. Then the access alarm on the panel beside the door lit up red. Bin 4 hatch. It flashed twice, then went dark. Bin 4 was the big one, the one where I'd seen the shape on the ladder. I didn't go outside right away. I stayed in the scale house maybe 10 minutes, watching through the window. Nothing moved. The glow didn't return. The bins looked normal against the dark sky. Eventually, I forced myself to leave because I couldn't stay locked in that office all night. The yard sounded normal again. Crickets near the ditch. Distant highway. Metal creaking quietly as temperatures dropped. The air still smelled faintly of hot metal, though. I walked fast to my pickup, keeping the bins on my left. The big bin's ladder sat empty. The access hatch wasn't visible from where I stood, not clearly. I started the truck. The engine turned over fine, but the radio came on to static even though I'd shut it off earlier. I turned the knob. Static. Changed station. Static. Then through it, I heard the same low voice again. Just one short phrase this time. It sounded like, "Not yet." I slapped the radio off hard enough to hurt my fingers and drove out of the lot without locking the main gate. I didn't sleep much. Around 6:30 the next morning, Dale called asking why the front gate was open. He sounded annoyed until he got to bin 4. Then he went quiet. I drove back out there even though I didn't want to. By the time I arrived, 2 other guys were standing near the big bin looking up. Dale had his hands on his hips. Miguel from the morning crew stood beside him smoking a cigarette he hadn't lit. The access hatch near the top of bin 4 was open, wide open. The lock was still hanging from the latch. That was the part nobody liked. The lock wasn't cut. The shackle was closed. The keyway looked fine. But the hatch door had somehow swung open with the lock still secured through the hasp, like the metal bracket around it had passed through the lock without breaking. Dale kept saying maybe someone forgot to latch it right. I told him I'd checked it from the ground the night before. He asked if I climbed up. I said no. He didn't ask anything else. We went up together later with harnesses to inspect it. The climb felt normal in daylight, but I could barely put my hands on the rungs without thinking about that shape I'd seen. Near the upper ladder, there were dark smears on the metal. Dirt. Fresh. Not grease. Not bird mess. Wet-looking dirt on dry steel. It formed long, narrow streaks along the outside of several rungs, like muddy fingers had wrapped around them from the wrong side. Dale touched one and smelled it. He made a face. Smells burned. At the hatch, the metal door felt warm, not sun-warm. The sun had barely hit that side yet, just warm enough that both of us noticed. Inside the bin, the grain looked normal, except for one place near the center. A shallow circular depression sat in the top layer, maybe 6 feet across. Not deep, just pressed smooth as if something broad and heavy had rested on the grain without sinking far into it. There were no footprints leading to it, no drag marks, nothing. Dale didn't say anything for a long time. On the way down, my boot slipped near the lower ladder cage. I grabbed the rung hard and felt something stuck underneath. A piece of pale material no bigger than a fingernail. Thin and brittle, almost translucent. I peeled it loose and held it between my fingers. It didn't feel like plastic or paint. Before I could show Dale, it crumbled into fine powder and blew away in the morning breeze. When I got home later, I found grain dust inside the collar of my jacket. Not on the outside. Inside. Packed along the back seam like somebody had poured a small handful down my neck. Mixed with it was the same dark dirt from the ladder. I shook the jacket over my porch. The dust fell in a narrow line across the boards. For a second, before the wind scattered it, the grains arranged themselves into a perfect circle. I found the circle just after sunrise on a Tuesday in early September. I worked as a groundskeeper for a public park outside Duluth, Minnesota. The park wasn't huge, but it covered enough land to keep a maintenance crew busy year-round. Ball fields, walking trails, picnic shelters, playgrounds, and a large open meadow near the western edge of the property. Most mornings started the same way. Unlock gates, check trash bins, look for storm damage, make sure nobody had vandalized anything overnight. That morning was cool and damp, the kind of morning where fog sat low over the grass and everything felt quiet. I was driving a utility cart toward the meadow when I noticed something unusual. At first I thought it was a patch of dead grass. Then I got closer. The circle was almost perfectly round, maybe 30 feet across. Every blade of grass inside it had been flattened. Not torn up, not burned, just pressed down, like something enormous had rested there overnight. I parked the cart and walked around it. The shape was precise, too precise. The edge formed a near-perfect boundary between flattened grass and normal grass. No tire tracks, no footprints, no signs of people. The center looked exactly like the outer edge, everything pressed in the same direction. I crouched down and touched it. The grass felt normal, slightly damp, nothing unusual. I remember standing there for several minutes trying to figure it out. Maybe kids, maybe some weird weather event, maybe somebody had used equipment after hours. None of those explanations really fit. I took a few photos with my phone and continued my morning. By lunch, the entire maintenance crew had heard about it. Everyone had an opinion. Wind, pranksters, a temporary structure removed overnight. One guy insisted it was caused by a small tornado. Another blamed campers. Nobody knew. The circle remained there all week. People started noticing it. Families walking through the park stopped to take pictures. Teenagers stood in the middle of it and filmed videos. Children treated it like a giant target painted on the ground. That part becomes important later. At the time, it seemed harmless. Wednesday evening, I was locking up one of the restroom buildings when I noticed a strange light over the trees. Nothing dramatic, just a single white light. Stationary. Low on the horizon. I assumed it was an aircraft, but when I glanced back a few minutes later, it was gone. The sight lasted maybe 20 seconds. I forgot about it almost immediately. Thursday morning, I found something else. Several dead birds. 3 of them, all within a few yards of the circle. That wasn't impossible. Birds die, animals die, parks have wildlife. Still, it caught my attention because the birds looked untouched. No injuries, no signs of predators, just lying there. I disposed of them and moved on. The next few days stayed normal, or mostly normal. The circle slowly became flatter. Kids kept playing there, people kept taking pictures, life went on. Then the men showed up. It was Friday afternoon, hot, sunny, the kind of late summer day where the air felt heavy. I was repairing a broken sprinkler head near the baseball fields when a coworker named Tyler drove over. "Some guys are looking for you." I wiped dirt off my hands. "What guys?" He shrugged. "Suits." That immediately sounded odd. Nobody wore suits to a public park. I followed him toward the maintenance building. The 2 men stood beside the entrance. Dark suits, dark ties, polished shoes, one tall and thin, one shorter and broader. Both looked completely out of place. The shorter man smiled when he saw me. "Mr. Cole Hensley?" "Yeah, we'd like a moment of your time." Neither introduced themselves, neither offered identification. The taller man carried a notebook. The shorter man carried nothing at all. I asked what this was about. The taller man answered, "Ground disturbance." Not an explanation, just 2 words. I frowned. "The circle?" Both men nodded. The shorter one asked, "Was any material collected?" I stared at him. "What?" "Samples." The word sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced it. "No." The taller man wrote something down. The shorter man continued, "No soil samples?" "No." "No vegetation samples?" "No." The men exchanged a glance. Relief. Actual relief. The kind people show when they hear good news. That caught my attention immediately. I asked who they worked for. The shorter man smiled. "Environmental review." Again, not really an answer. The taller man asked another question. "Has anyone else collected material from the site?" "Not that I know of." More writing, then silence. The shorter man looked toward the meadow. "May we see it?" I drove them over in the utility cart. Neither spoke much during the ride. The tall one occasionally looked at the sky. The shorter one watched the trees. Not casually, carefully, like he expected to see something. When we reached the circle, both men got out immediately. They walked around the perimeter, slowly, studying it. The taller man never stepped inside, not once. The shorter man eventually did, only briefly, just enough to examine the center. Then he stepped back out, Neither touched anything. Neither took photographs, neither used measuring equipment. The whole inspection felt strangely incomplete. After several minutes, the shorter man turned toward me. "How many people entered this area?" I laughed. "Hundreds." That answer seemed to surprise him. "How many?" "It's a public park." The taller man stopped writing. The shorter man's smile faded slightly. "Hundreds?" "Probably." A long silence followed. Then came the question. "Were children among them?" I nodded. The reaction was immediate. The taller man looked up from the notebook. The shorter man went completely still. For the first time since arriving, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. Not scared. Uneasy. Like he'd heard something he didn't want to hear. "Children played here?" he asked. "Yeah." His eyes drifted toward the circle, then toward the playground in the distance. The taller man said quietly, "When?" "All week." The two men exchanged a look. Not confusion, not surprise. Concern. Real concern. The shorter man rubbed the back of his neck, a completely human gesture. The first normal thing I'd seen him do. Then he asked, "Any illnesses?" "What?" "Among the children." "No." He seemed relieved. Again, that same relief I'd seen earlier. I finally lost patience. "What exactly are you worried about?" Neither answered. The taller man closed the notebook. The shorter man changed the subject immediately. "Has the shape altered since discovery?" I stared at him. The question felt deliberate, like he wanted to move on. I answered anyway. "A little?" "How?" "Flatter." The taller man nodded, almost as if he expected that. The shorter man walked around the edge one final time, then stopped suddenly. His attention focused on something near the center. I looked too. Nothing. Just grass. Yet he stared for several seconds, then looked away. Whatever had caught his attention apparently wasn't there anymore. The interview continued another 10 minutes. Most questions made little sense. Had animals avoided the area? Not really. Had anyone reported unusual dreams? No. Had park visitors mentioned humming sounds? No. Had lights been observed nearby? I remembered the white light over the trees. When I mentioned it, both men became interested immediately. Not excited, focused. The taller man asked exactly where I'd seen it. The shorter man asked how long it remained visible. When I finished describing it, neither commented. The notebook came out again. More writing. Eventually, the men thanked me for my time. That should have been the end. But before leaving, the shorter man asked one final question. A strange one. "Did the circle appear complete when you found it?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Was any portion missing?" "No." He nodded slowly. The answer seemed important. Then both men headed toward the parking lot. I followed at a distance, mostly because I wanted to see what kind of vehicle they drove. A black sedan waited near the entrance. No visible license plate, no dealership badge, no manufacturer logo, nothing, just smooth black paint. The men got inside. The sedan drove away. I stood there watching until it disappeared. Then I returned to work. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation, especially the part about the children. Why would that bother them? The circle wasn't dangerous, at least not as far as I knew. Saturday morning, I arrived early. The meadow looked normal from a distance. Then I noticed the circle had changed. Not dramatically, just enough to bother me. The grass inside had begun standing back up, except for one section. A narrow strip running through the center remained completely flattened, almost like a path. I hadn't noticed it before. I walked across the circle. The strip led toward a small cluster of trees at the edge of the meadow. Nothing unusual waited there, just trees. Yet something about the alignment felt deliberate. I followed it anyway. About 50 yards into the trees, I found a shallow depression in the soil. Not a hole, just an indentation, roughly circular, maybe 3 feet wide. The dirt inside looked darker than the surrounding ground. I stared at it for a while, then left. I didn't tell anyone. Something about it felt ridiculous. By Monday, the circle had nearly vanished. Grass continued rising. The shape became harder to see. Within another week, it was mostly gone. Just a faint discoloration remained. Life returned to normal. Then, nearly a month later, I received a call from Tyler. "Remember those suit guys?" "Yeah, you should come look at something." I met him after work. He drove me to the maintenance shed. Without speaking, he handed me a photograph. Security camera image. Nighttime. The meadow. The circle was still visible in the picture because the footage had been recorded before it disappeared. 2 men stood inside it. The same 2. The timestamp showed 3:12 a.m., several days after they'd visited. Both stood perfectly still near the center, looking down, not at the grass, at something between them. Something the camera couldn't quite resolve. A blurry shape, dark, low to the ground. The next frame showed the men alone. The shape was gone. The frame after that showed the circle empty. No men, no shape, nothing. Tyler asked if I knew where they'd gone. I told him no. Then I noticed something else, the timestamp. 3 minutes had passed between the second frame and the third. Not one frame, 3 full minutes. Yet the footage contained no images from that period, just a gap, as if the camera had simply stopped recording. The next morning, I walked out to the meadow before sunrise. The circle had long since vanished. Only normal grass remained. Children played soccer there later that afternoon. Families spread picnic blankets nearby. Nobody noticed anything unusual. But standing in the exact center, I could still make out a faint ring in the grass if the light hit it just right. And every once in a while, usually near sunset, I would catch people stopping as they crossed that spot. Not for long. Just a second, looking down, like they'd noticed something, then continuing on without saying a word. I found the folder on a hot August afternoon while reorganizing a storage room beneath the museum. The museum sat in a small town along the Oregon coast. It wasn't large, mostly local history, logging exhibits, fishing artifacts, old photographs, and donated family collections. The sort of place where every room smelled faintly of paper, wood polish, and dust. I'd worked there for 6 years as the archivist. Most days were predictable. Catalog documents, digitized photographs, answer questions from researchers, nothing exciting. The storage room was in the basement behind a locked steel door. We kept uncatalogued donations there until they could be processed. That day, I was sorting through several boxes that had arrived years earlier from an estate donation. Old newspapers, property records, letters, the usual. Then I found a gray file folder tucked inside a cardboard records box. No catalog number, no accession sticker, nothing, just a typed label. Coastal Incident Reports, 1954 to 1958. That immediately caught my attention because I'd never seen it before. I sat down at a work table and opened it. Inside were roughly 30 reports, typed pages, handwritten witness statements, police notes, newspaper clippings. Most involved strange lights, objects over the ocean, reports from fishermen, Coast Guard sightings, pilots, lighthouse keepers. Some were easy to explain, others weren't. One report described a white light pacing a fishing vessel offshore for nearly 40 minutes. Another involved multiple witnesses watching something hover above a headland before shooting away. A sheriff's deputy had written 3 pages describing a silent object over Highway 101. What stood out wasn't the sightings themselves, it was how carefully everything had been collected. Every witness, every date, every location, cross-referenced and organized. Someone had spent years building the file, yet there was no indication who. No author, no department, no explanation for why it existed. I spent nearly 2 hours reading through it. By the time I left work, I was genuinely interested, not convinced of anything, just curious. That evening, I took notes home. The next morning, I returned to the museum early. The weather had changed overnight. Heavy fog rolled in from the ocean and wrapped around the town. The harbor disappeared completely. Even the buildings across the street looked blurred and distant. Around noon, I was still reviewing the documents when Sandra, our receptionist, called down from the front desk. "Leah? Yeah? There are 2 men asking for archives. I figured researchers had arrived. That happened occasionally. Send them back." A minute later, the 2 men entered the archive room. The moment I saw them, something felt off. Not threatening, just wrong. Both wore dark suits despite the summer weather. One was tall and thin with pale skin and neatly combed black hair. The other was shorter, broader, with a polite smile that never seemed to change. Neither carried a briefcase. Neither introduced themselves. The taller man spoke first. "We'd like to review a collection recently located in storage." I stared at him. "What collection?" "Coastal Incident Reports." The exact title. My stomach tightened slightly. The folder hadn't been cataloged. Nobody should have known I'd found it. I asked who they were. The shorter man smiled. "Records review." "From where?" A pause. Then, "Regional." Not a real answer. I considered refusing. Instead, curiosity got the better of me. I retrieved the folder. The taller man immediately opened it. Both began reading. What struck me was how familiar they seemed with the contents. Not because they quoted anything for his doubt, because they flipped directly to specific pages. One witness statement, then another, then a newspaper clipping. Almost like they already knew where everything was. The shorter man stopped on a report dated 1956. A fishing captain had described 3 lights moving over the water during a storm and read it carefully. Then asked, "Have any additional versions of this report been located?" "Not that I'm aware of," he nodded. The taller man turned another page. A pilot sighting from 1957. He read it, then looked disappointed, not confused, disappointed, as though something was missing. After about 20 minutes, the shorter man pointed toward the photocopier across the room. "We'll require copies." "No problem." I stood and walked over. The machine was a large office copier we'd had for years. Simple enough. Open lid. Place document. Press button. The shorter man followed. Then something strange happened. He stared at the copier, not casually. Studied it, like he'd never seen one before. I assumed he was joking. "Need help?" I asked. His smile remained unchanged. "Yes." The answer surprised me. I showed him where the originals went. He watched carefully. Too carefully. Like he was memorizing each step. When I finished, he looked at the control panel. "Which command initiates duplication?" The wording sounded odd. I pointed to the copy button. He pressed the wrong one immediately. The machine started scanning to email. He stepped backward, actually startled. The taller man approached. "What did it do?" "It's scanning." Neither moved. The copier beeped. The shorter man looked at me. "Why?" I laughed because I genuinely thought they were messing with me. Neither laughed back. I canceled the job and showed them again. The taller man tried next. Same thing. He pressed 3 unrelated buttons before finding the correct one. I remember thinking it felt like watching someone use a copier after being told about one but never actually seeing it. The whole thing should have been funny. Instead, it felt unsettling. Neither man seemed embarrassed, just confused. Eventually, we got the copies made. The shorter man gathered them into a neat stack, then asked another strange question. "How long has this machine been here?" I shrugged. "Maybe 10 years. He looked at the copier, then at the taller man. Something passed between them. A look, not surprise, calculation. The taller man changed subjects immediately. "Who located the folder?" "I did." "When?" "Yesterday." "Did you review it?" "Of course." Both men became very still. The shorter man asked, "How much did you read?" "Most of it." Another look. Then silence. The taller man flipped through his notebook. "Did any report seem familiar?" The question caught me off guard. "Familiar how?" "No particular reason." I thought about it. One report actually had felt familiar. The 1957 pilot sighting. Not because I'd seen it before, because the location mentioned happened to be near a headland I'd visited often growing up. I told him that. The answer seemed to relax both men. The shorter one nodded. Geographic familiarity. The way he said it sounded like a diagnosis. Then came another question. "Did any report seem personally familiar?" I frowned. "No." Again, visible relief. That was the second time I'd seen them react emotionally. Both times it involved what I had or hadn't recognized. The conversation continued another 15 minutes. Most questions focused on the reports themselves, not the sightings, not the witnesses. The reports, who wrote them, how they arrived at the museum, whether any pages appeared missing, whether duplicates existed, whether I'd found related materials. I had no answers. Eventually, they packed up their copies. The shorter man thanked me. The taller man closed the folder. Then he paused. "May we review one final item?" "What?" He turned to the last page in the collection. I hadn't paid much attention to it before. A simple typed sheet. No witness statement, no report, just a list of names, 23 of them. No explanation. The taller man studied it for nearly a minute, then closed the folder. "Thank you." I expected them to leave. Instead, the shorter man looked toward the archive shelves. "How often are records relocated?" "What do you mean?" "Moved." I shrugged. "Whenever necessary." He nodded slowly, then asked, "And afterward, do they generally remain where placed?" The question felt bizarre. "Usually." He seemed satisfied. The 2 men finally left, or so I thought. About 10 minutes later, I walked through the lobby and found them standing beside the museum's self-service touchscreen kiosk, just staring at it. The screen displayed local exhibit information. Nothing complicated. The shorter man tapped it. A menu appeared. He immediately withdrew his hand. The taller man leaned closer. Neither seemed to understand what they were looking at. Sandra later described them as acting like tourists from another country. That wasn't quite right. It felt more like they were encountering everyday objects slightly out of sequence, as if they'd learned what things were called before learning how they worked. Eventually, they left. I watched through the front windows. A black sedan sat at the curb, no visible license plate, no manufacturer logo, just black paint and dark glass. They drove away. I assumed that would be the end. It wasn't. The next morning, I returned to the archive room. The folder was gone. Not missing exactly. Gone. Its catalog entry didn't exist. The storage box where I'd found it was empty. Even the notes I'd taken had vanished from my desk drawer. I spent most of the day searching. Nothing. Sandra noticed my frustration. When I explained what happened, she looked confused. What folder? The coastal reports. She frowned. What coastal reports? I thought she was joking. She wasn't. The visitor log showed no record of the two men, no names, no sign-in sheet, nothing. The security cameras should have settled the matter. Instead, they made it worse. I reviewed footage from the previous afternoon. The men appeared entering the building, appeared reading documents, appeared using the photocopier, everything normal. Until I reached the section where they copied the reports. The footage showed them standing beside the machine, looking at it, waiting, watching. For almost 6 minutes, the copier never moved, never operated, no papers entered, no papers emerged. Yet, I clearly remembered helping them use it, remembered holding the documents, remembered hearing the machine run. The video showed none of that. I watched it 3 times, same result. The men stood motionless beside an inactive copier, then walked away. That evening, after everyone else left, I returned to the archive room one last time. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. The room felt unusually quiet. The fog outside had returned. The windows looked gray and opaque. I sat at the work table where I'd first opened the folder. Something caught my eye underneath the table. A single sheet of paper, folded in half. I picked it up. The page was yellowed with age, old typewriter text, no heading, no date, just a short paragraph. It read, "Follow-up review completed. Materials removed for reclassification. Copies not authorized. Return expected within approximately 70 years." At the bottom sat 2 signatures, one tall and narrow, one shorter, both written in black ink. The paper crumbled slightly at the edges when I touched it, like it had been sitting there for decades. I looked closer. Beneath the signatures, someone had written a note in pencil, very faint, almost erased. I could barely read it. It said, "They still don't understand the machines." I noticed it about 10 minutes after we left the yard. At first, I thought it was just a reflection off the windshield or something catching on the glass, but it didn't behave like that. It held steady in one spot, no matter how the train moved. My name's Callum Briggs. I work as a rail technician, mostly night shifts, riding along on maintenance runs or freight routes to keep an eye on systems. That night, I was up in the cab with Darren, the driver. We were hauling a long freight line through a stretch of open countryside, nothing but flat fields and scattered trees for miles. It was just past 1 a.m., clear sky, no clouds, good visibility. I was leaning forward, checking a readout on the panel, when I caught the light out of the corner of my eye, above us. Not directly overhead, but slightly forward and to the right. I straightened up and looked through the windshield. There it was. A single bright point. White, steady, not blinking like an aircraft, not moving across the sky like a satellite either, just sitting there. But we were moving, about 50 miles an hour, and the light stayed in the exact same relative position. I frowned, trying to figure out what I was looking at. "Darren, you see that?" I asked. He glanced up briefly, then back to the track. "Star?" he said. "No," I said. "It's not moving." He looked again, longer this time. The light held its position. Same angle, same distance, at least as far as I could tell. Darren squinted a bit, then shrugged. "Probably something lined up weird," he said. "Happens sometimes." But it didn't feel like that. I've seen stars line up with movement before, where they seem to hang in place for a bit as you drive. But this was different. It wasn't drifting at all, not even slightly. I leaned closer to the glass, trying to get a clearer view. The light was sharper than a star, more defined and brighter. But it didn't cast any light onto anything. It didn't illuminate the cab or reflect off the rails. It just existed there. I checked my watch. 1:12 a.m. I remember that because I started timing it without really deciding to. We kept moving. The track ran straight for a long stretch, then curved slightly. The light didn't shift, didn't adjust. It just stayed locked in that same position relative to us. I sat back in my seat, watching it. Every few seconds, I'd glance at something else, the gauges, the track ahead, the side window, then back at the light. It never moved. I started trying to judge distance. That's where it got confusing. It didn't look close, but it didn't look far either. There was no depth to it, no way to tell how high up it was. It could have been a few hundred feet above us, or miles. I had no idea. "Still there?" Darren asked after a while. "Yeah," I said. He shook his head slightly. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than to me. The radio crackled for a second. Not unusual, just a quick burst of static. But the moment it happened, the light seemed to pulse, just once. A subtle change in brightness, then back to normal. I leaned forward again. "Did you see that?" I asked. Darren didn't answer right away. He was looking straight ahead, but I could tell he'd noticed something. "Yeah," he said finally. We both went quiet after that. The train kept moving. The countryside rolled past in the dark. The light stayed exactly where it had been. I checked my watch again, 1:26. 14 minutes. No change. I shifted in my seat, trying to see it from a different angle. I leaned slightly toward the side window. From there, it looked the same. Still above us. Still forward. Still fixed. I moved back to center. No difference. It didn't behave like something in the sky. It behaved like something attached to us. But it wasn't. There was nothing on the train that could produce that kind of light, and nothing that could sit out ahead like that. The radio crackled again, longer this time, a low, drawn-out hiss. The light pulsed again, slightly brighter this time, then settled. I felt this strange tightness in my chest. Not pain, just a sense that something wasn't right, like things were lining up in a way they shouldn't. I checked the instruments. Everything normal. Speed steady. No warnings. No anomalies. I looked back at the light. Still there. Still matching us perfectly. "Try changing speed," I said. Darren glanced at me. "Why?" "Just try it." He hesitated for a second, then eased the throttle. The train slowed slightly. Not much, just a small drop. The light adjusted instantly. Still in the same position. No lag, no acceleration. Just matched. Darren let out a quiet breath. "All right," he said. "That's not normal." We sped back up. The light stayed with us. I checked my watch again. 1:41, almost half an hour. Still there. I started to notice something else then. The stars around it looked faint. Not gone. Just dimmer, like the light was affecting them somehow, even though it wasn't bright enough to wash them out. I blinked a few times, trying to focus. For a second, I thought I saw a shape around the light. Not a clear outline. Just a subtle difference in the sky. Like something was there, and the light was part of it. Then it was gone. Or maybe I just couldn't see it clearly anymore. The train moved into another long, straight section of track. Fields on both sides, no trees. Wide open. The light didn't change, didn't drift, didn't flicker, just stayed locked in place. I stopped checking my watch after a while. Time felt stretched, like it wasn't moving the way it should. We didn't talk much, just occasional glances at each other, then back at the light. After what felt like forever, but was probably close to an hour, I looked up again and it was gone. No fading, no movement away, just not there anymore. The sky was normal, stars in their usual places, nothing out of the ordinary. I leaned forward, scanning the sky. Nothing. I looked to the sides, behind us, everywhere I could see. Nothing. "Where'd it go?" Darren said quietly. I didn't answer. I checked my watch. 2:08 a.m. 2:08 a.m. I tried to work it out in my head, from when I first saw it to now. Just under an hour. I sat back in my seat, staring at the empty sky ahead. The radio crackled once more. Short, sharp, then silence. Everything else felt normal again. The train, the track, the night. But for that whole stretch, it had been there, holding that exact position like it was locked onto us, or we were locked onto it. And the moment it disappeared, it felt like something had just let go without ever showing what it actually was. The lights turned on before I even reached the door. I was halfway down the service stairwell when I saw the glow spill under the exit at the bottom landing. That hallway shouldn't have been lit unless someone was in it. Motion sensors controlled the whole stretch. My name's Darren Cole. I worked as an electrician on contract at a maintenance facility tied to a larger base. Not the main runway side, this was one of the older buildings, mostly used for storage and occasional equipment servicing. Night shifts were common for us. Less traffic, fewer interruptions. That night was quiet, just me and one other guy somewhere on the opposite end of the building. I'd been up on the roof checking a ventilation unit that kept tripping a breaker. Nothing unusual. I finished up, packed my tools, and headed back down. That's when I saw the light. It wasn't just on, it was moving. I opened the door slowly and stepped into the corridor. The lights were switching on one by one down the length of the hallway. Not all at once, sequential, like something was walking through, triggering each sensor in turn, except there was no one there. The corridor was straight, about 50 meters long. Concrete walls, low ceiling, exposed piping along one side. No corners, no blind spots. I could see the entire stretch, and it was empty, but the lights kept coming on. Click. A section lit up about 10 feet ahead. Click. Another further down. Each one staying on for a few seconds before dimming again, then going dark. Behind the last lit section, like something was moving away from me, I just stood there, watching it happen, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a wiring issue, faulty sensors, but the timing was too clean, too consistent. Each light activated at the exact same interval, same distance apart, same delay before switching off. It reached the end of the hallway. The last light flicked on, held for a second, then went out, and everything was dark again, except for the dim emergency strips along the floor. I waited. Nothing happened. I walked forward slowly, checking each sensor as I passed. They looked fine, no loose wiring, no visible damage. I waved my hand in front of one. It clicked on immediately. Normal response. I stepped back, it stayed on for a few seconds, then shut off. Exactly as expected. I continued down the hall, half expecting something else to happen. Nothing did, just the hum of the building. Air moving through ducts, distant mechanical noise. At the end of the corridor, I turned around and looked back. Everything was dark again, like it had never happened. I didn't say anything to anyone that night. Figured I'd check the system logs in the morning. Maybe there'd be a record of sensor activity. Next day, I pulled the data. Every sensor in that corridor had triggered, one after another. Perfect sequence, timestamp down to the second. But there was no corresponding access log, no door entries, no personnel movement, nothing. I mentioned it to Rick, one of the supervisors. He shrugged. Probably a glitch, he said. Old system. That made sense, on paper, but it didn't sit right. A few nights later, I was back in the same building. Different job, same corridor. This time, I was ready for it. I finished up early and waited near the stairwell. Just stood there, leaning against the wall, watching the dark hallway. Around 1:40 a.m., it happened again. Same pattern. The first light clicked on halfway down the hall, then the next, moving in a straight line. Steady pace. I stepped out into the corridor this time, walked toward it. The lights kept activating ahead of me, but I couldn't catch up. No matter how fast I moved, the lit section stayed just out of reach, always about 20 feet ahead. Then, for a second, something changed. One of the lights flicked on closer than the others, only a few feet in front of me. I froze. The light stayed on, longer than the others had. I looked at the floor. Nothing. The walls. Nothing. The air felt off. Not colder, not warmer, just different. Like the space around me had shifted slightly. Then the light went out, and the sequence continued down the hall. I followed it to the end again, same result. Darkness. Silence. That time, I went straight to the security office, asked to review the camera footage. They had a fixed camera at each end of the corridor. Both views covered the entire length. We pulled the footage, watched it together. The lights came on, one by one, exactly as I'd seen. But the hallway was empty. No shadows, no movement. Nothing triggering the sensors. Just lights turning on and off in sequence. The guy reviewing it with me, Thomas, leaned back in his chair. Probably a sensor calibration issue, he said. I didn't respond. We both knew that didn't explain it. Sensors don't activate like that on their own, not in a pattern, not consistently. Over the next week, it kept happening. Not every night, but often enough. Always the same. Lights moving down the corridor, always in one direction, never reversing, never stopping halfway. Just a steady progression from one end to the other. One night, I tried something different. I stood at the far end of the corridor. where the sequence always ended. Waited there. When it started, I watched the lights approach me, one by one, getting closer. Each activation bringing that same faint sense of something passing through, even though I couldn't see anything. When the second to last light came on, I held my breath. The last light flicked on right in front of me, and for a split second, I thought I saw something. Not a shape, not clearly, just a slight distortion in the air, like heat shimmer. But colder, if that makes sense. It lasted maybe half a second. Then the light went out, and the hallway was dark again. I didn't move, just stood there, waiting. Nothing else happened. I checked the footage again later, same as before. Empty corridor, lights activating on their own, no visible cause. Eventually, I stopped trying to figure it out. Marked the sensors as functional. No faults detected, because technically they weren't broken. They were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. Detecting movement, just not movement anyone could see. And what stuck with me wasn't just the lights or the footage. It was the pattern, the consistency, the way it always moved through that space the same way. Like it knew the path, like it was following something or going somewhere through a corridor that only reacted to it, even when there was nothing there for anyone else to notice. I was working nights in the clinic when they brought him in. My name's Eric Daly. I used to be a medic on a base out in New Mexico. Small place, mostly support and testing work. Nothing you'd hear about unless you were stationed there. Most nights were slow, minor injuries, dehydration, the usual. That night, it was around 2 a.m. when security came in with a guy I hadn't seen before. Late 30s, maybe early 40s. Name was listed as Nolan Greer. He wasn't in uniform, just standard technician coveralls. He didn't look hurt, but something was off. His face was pale in a way that didn't match the heat outside, and he kept glancing over his shoulder like someone was following him. One of the guards gave me a quick rundown. Found him disoriented, he said. Says he needs medical. That was it. No details, no urgency in his tone either. Just routine. I got Nolan into one of the exam rooms. Had him sit down, checked his vitals. Everything was mostly normal. Heart rate a little elevated, but not extreme. Breathing steady, no visible injuries. You feeling dizzy? I asked. He nodded, then shook his head like he wasn't sure. Not dizzy, he said. Just off. His voice sounded strained, like he'd been talking for a long time before he got there. I asked him what happened. At first, he hesitated, kept looking toward the door, then he leaned forward slightly. I was working, he said, inside one of the chambers. I didn't know what he meant by that exactly, but I didn't press. Doing what? I asked. Maintenance checks, he said. Routine. He swallowed hard. The lights flickered. That didn't sound unusual on its own. Power fluctuations happen. But the way he said it made it feel like it mattered. How long did they flicker? I asked. Couple seconds, he said. Maybe less. He rubbed his hands together like he was trying to warm them up. It wasn't the lights, he added quietly. Not really. I waited, didn't interrupt. He kept his voice low. Everything dimmed at once, he said. Not just overhead, panels, indicators, everything. I made a note of it. Still sounded like a power issue. Then he said, I thought I saw something. That got my attention. Where? I asked. He looked at me like he wasn't sure if he should answer. Then he pointed toward the wall behind me. Through the glass, he said. I turned slightly, even though there was nothing there but the clinic wall. What kind of glass? I asked. Thick, he said, like reinforced. Observation panel. I nodded, trying to keep it neutral. What did you see? He took a breath. A shape, he said. His eyes flicked back to the door again. Faint, not clear. He held his hands up slightly, like he was trying to frame it. It didn't move right, he said. I asked him what he meant. He shook his head. I thought it was my reflection, he said. At first, that made sense. Low light, reflective surfaces, easy to mistake things. But it wasn't matching me, he added. I felt a slight shift in the room then. Not physically, just the tone of the conversation. How so? I asked. He leaned back a little. Delay, he said, or something like that. He rubbed his face. I moved, he said. It didn't, or it moved different. I didn't say anything, just let him keep going. It was there for a second, he said, maybe 2. He swallowed again. Then the lights came back. And it was gone, I asked. He nodded. Yeah, I wrote that down. Part of me was already filing it under stress response, fatigue, overwork. People see things sometimes, especially in environments like that. Still, I asked, "Did you feel anything else, before or after?" He hesitated, then said, "Pressure." "Where?" "Head," he said. "Ears." He tapped the side of his skull lightly, like when you go underwater too fast. I made a note of that too. His vitals still looked fine. What of no signs of concussion, no fever, no obvious cause for what he was describing? "Did you lose consciousness at any point?" I asked. "No." "Lose track of time?" He paused. "I don't think so," he said. But the way he said it didn't sound certain. I was about to ask more when there was a knock on the door. One of the guards stepped in slightly. "Everything good?" he asked. I said we were still checking him out. The guard nodded, but didn't leave right away. He just stood there for a second, looking at Nolan. Then he stepped back out and closed the door. When I turned back, Nolan's posture had changed. He was sitting straighter, hands flat on his knees, looking at the floor. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded. "Yeah," he said. His voice sounded different, flatter. I asked if he wanted to continue. He shook his head. "Must have just been the lights," he said. "Messing with me." That wasn't what he'd been saying a minute ago. "You sure?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "I'm good." He wouldn't elaborate anymore. Every question I asked after that got short answers, no details, no hesitation, just done. I finished the basic exam, cleared him medically. Not much else I could do. The guards took him out. That should have been the end of it. But later that morning, I checked the report. His initial statement, the part about the glass, the silhouette, it wasn't in there. Just listed as temporary disorientation due to lighting fluctuation. Nothing else. I asked one of the admin staff about it. They said that's what he told them. No mention of anything unusual. I didn't push it, but I remembered how he described it. That shape. Not matching him. Not moving the same way. A few days later, I saw him again, across the base. He didn't recognize me, or at least he acted like he didn't. Just walked past, normal, calm, like nothing had happened. But for a second, when he passed a window, I noticed him glance at it, quick, like he didn't want to look, and then look away again, just a little too fast, like he was making sure whatever he'd seen before wasn't there this time. I was parked outside the north checkpoint a little after midnight, engine off, paperwork on the dash, just waiting for clearance to bring the tanker through. My name's Daniel Rios. I'd been hauling aviation fuel out to that base twice a week for almost a year. Most nights were boring. You sat there, watched the desert, tried not to fall asleep. It was late August, still hot even at night. The kind of heat that clings to the asphalt and makes everything smell like rubber and dust. No wind. No clouds. The sky was clear enough that the stars looked sharp. I remember because I was staring at them when I noticed something off near one of the distant hangars. From where I waited, you could see the outer row of buildings if you looked past the fence line and over the low rise. Most of the hangars sat dark at that hour. Every now and then you'd see headlights move or a door crack open, but that night it was quiet. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The air above one hangar looked like it was wavering, like heat rising off a highway in the middle of summer. But it wasn't the ground doing it. It was higher up, maybe 50 feet above the roof. I blinked a few times, took off my glasses and wiped them on my shirt. When I looked again, it was still there. It wasn't a glow. There weren't any lights. It was just a distortion. The stars directly above that hangar looked slightly bent, like you were looking at them through moving water. The outline of the building beneath it seemed softer too, almost blurred. I told myself it had to be heat coming off the roof. Maybe some kind of venting system, but it didn't look random. The distortion had edges. Not sharp edges exactly, but boundaries, like something large was sitting there, and the air around it was warping. I leaned forward in the cab and turned off the radio completely. I wanted to hear if there was anything, engines, rotors, anything at all. Nothing. The desert was dead quiet. I checked my phone for the time, 12:17 a.m. I remember that specifically because I considered texting my buddy Marco, who used to run this route before me, just to say, "You ever see anything weird out here?" But I didn't. It felt stupid. The distortion seemed to deepen. The air above the hangar shimmered harder, like when you open an oven door and that blast of heat hits you. The stars behind it bent more noticeably now. And the shape, if that's what it was, felt wider, than the building itself. Still no sound. I stepped out of the truck. The heat from the day was still radiating up from the pavement. My boots made that soft crunch on gravel as I moved closer to the fence line, though I stayed well back from it. There were cameras everywhere. The last thing I needed was a guard thinking I was wandering around. From outside the cab, it was even clearer. It looked like a massive, invisible thing was parked above that hangar. Not floating high, just resting there, maybe 10 or 15 feet above the roof. The air around it rippled in layers. I could trace a rough curve along the top where the distortion seemed strongest. I tried to convince myself it was just thermal exhaust. Maybe something inside was venting hot air upward. But if that were true, there would have been steam, smoke, something visible. There was nothing. And then I noticed something else. The lights around that hangar, the small security floods mounted along the walls, looked dimmer than the rest. Not off, just slightly muted, like someone had turned them down. I checked the other buildings. Their lights looked normal. I started to feel this pressure in my chest, not pain, just this heavy awareness that I was watching something I wasn't supposed to be seeing. My phone buzzed in my hand. It made me flinch so hard I almost dropped it. It was just the dispatcher updating my wait time. 15 more minutes. When I looked back up, the distortion had changed. It wasn't as intense. It was shrinking, pulling inward toward the center point above the hangar. The air around it smoothed out gradually, like ripples settling on a pond. Still no sound, no sudden movement, just that shimmer fading. And right as the last of it disappeared, the hangar doors began to close. They hadn't been opened before. I was sure of that. I'd been looking at that building for at least 10 minutes. The doors had been sealed shut. Now they were sliding together slowly, the heavy metal panels meeting in the middle. No bright lights spilled out, no silhouettes, just darkness behind them. Once the doors sealed, the building looked completely normal. The lights along the walls brightened back to match the others. That was it. No roar of engines, no aircraft taking off, no vehicles moving in or out, just silence. I stood there for a while, waiting for something else to happen. I kept expecting to hear a delayed boom, see something shoot up into the sky. Nothing did. When clearance finally came through, I climbed back into the truck. My hands were shaking more than I wanted to admit. I told myself it was just the heat. As I rolled through the checkpoint, one of the guards, a guy I'd seen plenty of times before, name patch said Henderson, gave me this long look. Not suspicious, just measured. I almost asked him. Almost said, "Hey, what was that above hangar 4?" But I didn't know the hangar numbers for sure, and something about the way he was watching me made me keep my mouth shut. Inside the base, everything looked routine. A few trucks moving around, some distant headlights, the same quiet industrial hum as always. While I was hooking up the hose to offload the fuel, I glanced toward that hangar again. From this angle, it looked completely ordinary. Solid. Still. But I noticed the concrete around it looked darker than the rest, like it had been recently washed or sprayed down. I finished the delivery and left without saying anything to anyone. On the drive back down the highway, I kept checking my mirrors. Not because I thought something was following me, exactly. It was more like I felt exposed. About 20 miles out, my dashboard clock flickered. It blinked off for maybe a second, then came back on. I figured it was just a loose wire. The truck was old, but the time read 12:46 a.m. That didn't make sense. I knew I'd left the base around 12:35 at the latest. The drive to where I was should have taken 15 minutes, minimum. I checked my phone, 12:53 a.m., 7 minutes difference. I pulled over on the shoulder and just sat there with the engine idling. I tried to retrace the drive in my head. The checkpoint, the straight stretch past the hills, the dry lake bed on the right. I couldn't remember passing the lake bed. It was like that section of road just wasn't there in my memory. I told myself I'd zoned out. It happens on long desert drives at night. You slip into autopilot. I restarted the truck to reset the clock. It synced back up with my phone. I drove the rest of the way home with the radio off. I didn't tell Marco. Didn't tell my wife either. What would I even say? I saw invisible heat above a hangar and maybe lost a few minutes. But the next time I had that route 2 weeks later, I checked that same hangar. Different night, cooler weather, a little wind, nothing unusual. Still, I didn't park facing it anymore while I waited. I turned the truck the other direction toward the open desert and kept my eyes on the road instead. I noticed it because it didn't match anything else on the system. My name's Daniel Price. I work night shifts monitoring grid load for a regional utility. Nothing exciting most nights, just watching numbers, logging irregularities, making sure nothing drifts too far out of range. You get used to patterns. Factories ramp up and down at certain times. Residential usage dips overnight. Everything has a rhythm to it, so when something doesn't fit, it stands out. The first time I saw it, I almost ignored it. A spike on one of the substation feeds. Sharp, clean, not gradual like normal usage. It jumped up, held steady for a few minutes, then dropped back to zero. I pulled up the details. The load was coming from a small branch tied to an older building on the edge of an industrial park.